Yeah, good morning, everybody. I think we'll kick off. Yeah, sorry for the late start, but obviously rain and traffic is causing chaos here in Joburg, and people are struggling to make the venue on time. But we have a really good number of people online, and so we're going to get started. And thank you, everybody, for your patience. So today is really about a consultation on the nationally determined contribution, and it fits into a longer program that the PCC are running. At the end of last year, we held a bunch of capacity building sessions where we worked with stakeholder groups to talk through what is an NDC, why is it important, why are we doing this engagement, and then now we are hoping to hear from you as the stakeholder groups. And then the third phase is we'll bring everybody together, and so we'll have a colloquium where we'll have civil society and business and labor and government talking to each other. And we will, from all of that, then make some recommendations to the president and his cabinet on what we think should be in the nationally determined contribution. So the format for today, and it's really important to note that the PCC has two parts, the commissioners themselves, and they are the ones that make the recommendations, and most of the people here today that you will meet are from the Secretariat, and we do the sort of background organizing and some of the research collation and so on. But this is a commissioner-led event, and so you'll see that there are a number of commissioners on the program, and the idea is the commissioners are hopefully representing your views on what they think should be in the NDC, or at least in our advice about the NDC. So the program, as you'll see on the tables, as we'll be having a welcome from Commissioner Baduza, then I will give a quick overview on the NDC and why it's important, and a little bit of background on the capacity building sessions we held last year. And then we've got three commissioners, Mr. Abdenor, Mr. Peak, and Ms. Nordia, who will talk about civil society commissioner perspectives, and then Errol Mshlambo from sort of grassroots organizations will talk as well. And then the idea is we'll have a short break and then come back and have a really good discussion session where we want to hear from you. So that's the plan for the day. Quick logistics, please do stay for lunch afterwards. Lunch will be in the restaurant. As you go out of the doors, turn right and down the stairs and you'll see it. If you need the bathrooms, they are just to the left of the restaurant, so head towards the restaurant and there's a passage and the bathrooms are in that passage. In terms of language, you know, I'm the weakest link in only being able to speak English, but the rest of the team can speak a whole range of languages. And so please feel free to ask questions in your own language, and we'll have someone in the room who can help translate for my understanding. Okay. All right, so that's the plan for the day. You're all very welcome, and we're very pleased to see you, and I'm really grateful that there's so many people online. And so I'm going to hand over to Commissioner Baduza to do a quick welcome and opening. Thank you.
Siyabonga, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well, thanks.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone in the room and online, and to my fellow commissioners and the Secretariat. We are so excited for this consultation, so I won't be long. You know, civil society is such a dynamic group of people and organizations. We have people who can speak with authority on mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. And that includes lived experience as an authority. So there is experience and wisdom in this room, and we want to tap into it and be guided by it. But it's important to just start off by acknowledging how this consultation is happening in a context where a lot is happening in our country and around the world. Locally, the impacts of the climate crisis is rearing its ugly head as we speak, and it's getting more and more intense. Some of us just need to look at the headlines, others just need to look outside. These past 2 months, there has been loss of life, destruction of homes, schools, roads, and bridges. And of course, the victims are almost always the same: poor Black men, women, and children, whose ability to adapt and recover is little to none. And currently, resources are channeled more to mitigation than they are to adaptation. So there's a need for a balance there. And constantly and continuously, we are found wanting where adaptation and resilience is concerned. Globally, oh my goodness. I was at a leadership forum this weekend, and the night before, we had witnessed that disgraceful behavior at the Oval Office by Trump and Vance. And someone said to us, you might think that geopolitics has nothing, you have nothing to do with geopolitics, but geopolitics has everything to do with you. The world is changing, and every decision made has implications for years to come. And it has implications for South Africa and how we respond to the climate crisis. However, the good news is that the nationally determined contribution offer us an opportunity. And as Commissioner Pukensi said in the consultation with local government, these NDCs are a call to action, one that we cannot ignore. But as we determine this call of action, we must remember to operate within the just transition framework and be guided by the principles of procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. At the back of our heads, we need to be asking ourselves, how does my contribution today add to distributive justice, which is the risks and opportunities resulting from the transition have to be distributed fairly, cognizant of race, gender, and class inequalities. How does my contribution today add to restorative justice, which is historical damages against individuals, communities, and the environment being addressed, with a particular focus on rectifying or ameliorating the situations of harmed or disenfranchised communities? And lastly, how does my contribution today add to procedural justice, which is workers, communities, and small businesses being empowered and supported in the transition, with them defining their own development and livelihoods? So with that, I wish you all a fruitful day of consultation and continue to be safe out there. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Okay, so with that welcome and some really important messages embedded in there already, I'm going to quickly do a refresher of what we did in our NDC capacity building program. How many of you were able to attend those capacity building programs last year? Just Richard. 2 people. Okay, and how many of you had the opportunity to watch the link in the bottom of the invite that had a link to the capacity building video? Okay. All right, so I will go a little bit slower then, and please feel free to ask me questions and kind of interrupt me, but try to give you the sort of background context to what we are doing and what an NDC is and why it's important. So the nationally determined contributions emerged out of the Paris Agreement. And up until the Paris Agreement, globally, we had been trying to negotiate top-down, legally binding commitments. And the Kyoto Protocol is the most famous example of that. And the problem with that system is it didn't work. People didn't, countries wouldn't sign up to it. And so it was difficult to get the kinds of gains that we needed. And so what happened in Paris was a shift in ethos. We moved from these top-down binding, legally binding commitments to a bottom-up voluntary commitment. Right, and so the NDCs then brought everybody into the fold, so everybody would make these voluntary bottom-up commitments, and then they tried to establish a series of rules that allowed improvement over time. So the NDCs go hand in hand with a parallel process called the global stocktake. Right? So after everybody's made their commitments, then the UN body responsible goes and assesses those commitments. It assesses the how we've achieved or not, whether the science has advanced or not, and it makes an assessment of whether we are on track or not to meet our climate goals. right? And so the phase in the cycle that we are now in is the global stocktake was completed 2 years ago and adopted at the United Arab Emirates COP. And now we are submitting our updated NDCs based on what we learned in the global stocktake at the end of this year. We're meant to have submitted them already, but only about 16 countries have actually met the February deadline for submission. And so now we've all moved to a kind of September deadline. Why is it important? The NDC embeds our climate targets and our contribution to a global effort to keep warming well below 2 degrees, ideally below 1.5 degrees. So the UAE consensus, which emerged from the COP in the UAE, basically said we should actually be going for below 1.5 degrees. That is the scientific threshold, right? And so this is what the NDC is about. But of course, what we're actually doing when we're talking about an NDC is designing our economy. How are we going to structure our economy in a way that we can stay below these targets without creating undue socioeconomic impacts? And that's really the discussion we're in, which is extremely challenging. So as we go through this, we'll see that this is a very daunting task. So just to highlight that the PCC played a part in the level of ambition described in the previous NDC, and what we did was we commissioned research by UCT at the time. We looked at other people's research at the time. The National Business Initiative had just released a study looking at net zero pathways, and then we hosted a range of public dialogues. So that's what we're doing again. Right? We've commissioned research more than just by UCT this time, a range of different organizations. We're collating the research of others, and we're hosting public dialogues like these. A little bit more intensive this time, and so we're hoping to get a lot of feedback and input, and we're trying to combine the feedback we get from stakeholders with the science. We kind of test the feedback against the science. It's very important to note that we are not drafting the NDC. Right, that is the job of DFFE. We are merely making recommendations to the president and his cabinet around what we think should be in an NDC as one input into the process that the DFFE are running. But it's just very important to note that it is the DFFE's responsibility to draft the NDC. And they will also be having a round of stakeholder consultations. So ours is more stakeholder focused, so we're focused on particular groups like civil society, whereas theirs will be more provincially focused. So they'll go to each province and try to engage with as many people as they can. So you will have a second bite at this, and you'll also be able to input into their process, but we will hopefully faithfully capture your thoughts. So you had a question? Please use the mic. So I should have said that in the setup. When you talk, please use the mic in front of you. You must press the button, it'll go red, and then it's live, and lean in a little bit, because otherwise the people online can't hear you. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I don't have a question, but I think the use of the acronyms. Yes. Sometimes you have to give us the full name before you use the acronyms.
Yes.
The DFF and the whatever. I don't know what is that.
Thank you.
So please just give us the full name, then use the acronyms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very guilty of that. I can speak whole sentences just in acronyms. So please do stop me if I use one that you don't know. So NDC is Nationally Determined Contribution, which comes out of the Paris Agreement, and DFFE is the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. So they are the national government department that are drafting the NDC. And if I just use one and don't notice, like just throw your hand up and I'll rewind my sentence a bit and see what I used. Thank you for that. That's helpful. Okay. So just as a last point, so the NDCs emerged out of the mitigation negotiations, right? How do we reduce our emissions over time? But they also have been used by different countries to talk about ambition and targets within adaptation, and then also as a signal for the kind of support that we need. So the climate language here is adaptation is the changes that we need to make in order to deal with the climate change that we are already experiencing and that we might experience in future. Right? So we're already experiencing impacts from a 1.5 degree world, but we might go to 3 degrees or 4 degrees. And so what do we have to think about in building resilience to those changes? Mitigation are the things that we do to reduce our emissions. And obviously emissions are very strongly causal of temperature change and therefore climate change. So the lower we can keep our global emissions, the lower the temperature rise will be, and the lower the variability will be in climate. And then means of implementation is UNFCCC, the United Nations body that looks after climate change, shorthand for support. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but the kinds of support that we are used to is financial support, but you could also have trade support, you could also have capacity building, you could also have intellectual property. There's a range of support mechanisms that we could draw on. So an NDC covers all three of these things, and so we will be gathering your thoughts and your input across adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation. Does it make sense so far? Okay. So just a little bit more about how the NDC interacts with our local regulatory system. So we've actually made a commitment to produce 2 documents under the Paris and subsequent agreements. One is the NDC, which is the targets, right? And the other is the LEDS, which is Low Emissions Development Strategy. And that is, how are we going to do it? What's our actual plan, right? And the governments are currently upgrading the LEDS in support of the NDC. And so that's probably also a process to engage on. But as I mentioned, these are non-binding. They're not legally binding agreements, but what we do and what all countries do is they create that kind of legal context through local regulatory systems. And the key sort of piece in this is the Climate Change Act. There's also the carbon tax and a whole range of other measures. But the Climate Change Act effectively does 2 things. It establishes the adaptation system and the mitigation system. The adaptation system requires all government entities, local governments, national government, provincial government, etc., to do a risk and vulnerability assessment. How are they vulnerable to climate change? And then a climate action plan, what are they going to do about it? Right, so that's a significant thing. And then on the other side is the mitigation system, and the mitigation system does a number of things, but the key thing for us at the moment is it establishes what are called sectoral emissions targets, or SETs. And they are effectively emissions reduction targets for each sector of the economy, and they then provide the link to how we meet our NDC. Right, does that make sense? So whatever our NDC looks like, we then need that to pass through into the sets and vice versa. It's a bit of an iterative process, but the sets are the legally binding target in South Africa. And then, of course, we have a whole bunch of sector-level policies and measures like the IRP, the Industrial Resource Plan, which is our electricity plan. We have the Integrated Energy Plan. We have the Green Transport Strategy. There's a whole bunch of sector policies and measures that then help us meet our sectoral targets. So that's kind of how the system interlinks. And government are currently also consulting on the sets. And so there's quite a sophisticated system that backs up our international commitments and our local legal compliance. Okay. So now the NDC, although it's voluntary and bottom up, you can't just set anything. Can't double your emissions, right? There's a bunch of rules and guidelines around how we think about setting up an NDC. And these are kind of the 4 key ones. There are a bunch of others, but these are the ones that kind of really frame how we think about them. And if you think about the global stocktake, right, saying that we're not on track to meet our targets, one of the rules is the NDC has to be more ambitious than the previous one in response to what we're learning from the global stocktake. It also has to be aligned with the requirements of science, and given the UAE consensus, especially a 1.5-degree trajectory. It also must represent a country's best effort. You have to seriously engage with this and think about what is possible and what is feasible and submit your best effort. Right? And then finally, as a transparency requirement, it must reflect why we think it's fair. Right, so we have to reflect on why we think whatever we've chosen is fair, globally and locally. Does that make sense? And this is not simple. There's a lot of tension, right? Stakeholders think different things, people think different things. And so whatever we come up with, whatever we agree as a society has to be locally credible. We as South Africans have to accept it. So for example, if it said something like, well, we must close all coal by next week, Wednesday, unlikely to be accepted, right? And so there's a balance there. It must be internationally credible. In other words, our international partners must believe that it is our best effort. And it must be scientifically credible. And there's a lot of tension here. Internationally credible, what does that mean these days? We've got, as Commissioner mentioned, we've got the White House saying some quite interesting things. We've got a shift to the right in many parts of Europe. So what is internationally credible these days? Right? Scientifically credible is a little bit easier to bear down. And then, of course, locally credible, as you know, people are quite divided around, particularly this idea of how fast should we transition? What is the pace and scale at which we must transition? So again, we're not pretending this process is simple, but it's important that it's done in a way that's inclusive. The Commissioner also mentioned this idea of procedural justice. And so this is part of what we are doing here at the PCC. Okay. So thinking about adaptation, right? It's important that we understand what we're really dealing with from a climate change impacts perspective. And the UNFCCC, the UN body that deal with climate change, have a group that collates all of the science and kind of compiles these huge, very complex reports that reflect on the science. And they call those assessment reports. We're currently in the 6th cycle of assessment reports, so the abbreviation is AR6. But for the first time in this latest cycle, they had a chapter on Africa. So we can now see some of the impacts specifically on Africa. And here are they. 34% reduction in agricultural output due to climate change. Right, so reduced income and growth and increased income inequality for African countries more so than anywhere else in the world. And that points to a general principle around climate change in that it impacts the poor the most. Right, the wealthy have better resources, they can recover faster, they have insurance, and so on, whereas the poor often cannot recover from these kinds of events, and you kind of see that reflected in the wealth of countries. Over 3.6 million weather-related displacements. So these are people forced from their homes because of either some creeping climate change like drought or some immediate high-impact event, extreme weather event, and a negative 5% impact on GDP per capita. So we're all 5% less well off. Right? Does that sound scary? Those are the impacts that have already happened. Right? The impacts that they project to happen are these. A further 25 to 75% reduction in agricultural output, depending on the crop or where we are. A 50% drop in South Africa's GDP by 2100. Right? And with 1.7 degrees of warming, 17 to 40 million climate migrants. And with 2.5 degrees of warming, 56 to 86 million climate migrants. Right? Now, what did the global stocktake say? The global stocktake said if everybody meets their commitments, which isn't even certain anymore, but if everybody meets their commitments, we are on track to a temperature rise of 2.1 to 2.8 degrees. So we are firmly in this space, right? Which would, if the science is correct, predict the population of South Africa displaced from their homes in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are really big impacts, and the position of the PCC is we should be actively avoiding these impacts, right? And the way to do that is to reduce our emissions. So the adaptation case puts an urgency on mitigation, if that makes sense. What else? So this is a study from the private sector by Swiss Re, which is predicting these changes in GDP by mid-century, so 2050. I said 2030 in one of the previous sessions, which was incorrect. But if we look at our temperature range, 2.5 to 2.8 degrees, we're somewhere here, negative 14 to negative 21.5% impact on GDP by 2050. So big changes, right? I mean, if you think about it, we stress if GDP goes to negative 0.2%. And now we're thinking, well, we might be closer to negative 20%. Richard?
Thanks.
Please use your mic so people online can hear you. And sorry, I didn't say it before. Please introduce yourself so people know who's talking.
Sorry, Steve, but I just thought for clarification. So this is by 2050. Thanks. I'm Richard Worthington. I'm a volunteer associate Project 2090 by 2030, but not a spokesperson for them. Swiss Re modeling and their preoccupation are the kind of assets that are insured, not all of the impacts on the economy as a whole. So just to contextualize that, I was trying to remember the numbers. I don't have them in front of me, but I know that one of the recent papers looking at impacts in Africa projected they will be a lot more severe under these scenarios. So just to note that this is very conservative and very much aligned with so the formal economy doesn't deal with the stuff that we don't capture in GDP, just for context. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important comment. And in fact, the Actuarial Society of the United Kingdom released a report a couple of weeks ago, which basically says we are vastly, vastly underestimating the risks and the financial impact. So if this is an underestimate, even more worrying. Thank you for that. The WITS Global Change Institute just down the road, world-class climate modelers, they're worried about these three, what they call tipping point risks that are becoming increasingly likely as climate change gets worse. At day zero in Gauteng, right? Some of the models are predicting that as early as 2028. All right, so we're not talking 2050 problems here. We're talking now problems. And you can imagine the socioeconomic impacts of Gauteng not having access to water. We had a trial run in Randburg a couple of weeks ago where we were out without water for, I think it was a week and a half. Collapse of the maize crop in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a frightening impacts. And then category 4 or 5 cyclones making landfall on the East Coast. And if we think about what we're building on the East Coast as some of our energy infrastructure, what kind of economic impact would that have? So all of this just to say, physical climate risk is enormous. We should be avoiding it. And therefore, we need a much more progressive program on mitigation, right? But at the same time, we are baked in to at least 2 degrees of warming, unless we up our ambition in this upcoming NDC cycle, and maybe anyway, depending on what happens with big international players. And so the challenge that we have to kind of walk is we need to be very ambitious in how we think about mitigation to avoid the worst of climate change, but we are going to get some climate change anyway, and so have to start planning and adapting and improving resilience. And we don't have a huge amount of time, so this is a chart also from the IPCC, which basically says the longer you wait, the fewer options you have. So if we only really start mitigating as a globe in 2035, a whole bunch of options to us are gone, right? And so the urgency is to start now. And just a useful way to think about, this is a piece that NBI did many years ago, but it's a useful way to frame all of the things that we have to think about when we're thinking about climate resilience, which we think of as preempting and withstanding variability and shocks in social, economic, and environmental conditions. And I think the examples I provided earlier, it's clear that these are not just environmental issues, right? They have big economic and social impacts. And there are 3 things we have to do. We have to be able to anticipate what's coming, we have to be able to adapt to what's coming, and we unfortunately also have to recover from extreme events that occur. So for example, we still haven't rebuilt some of the roads and bridges that were washed away in Durban a few years ago. And so recovery takes planning. It also costs a lot of money. The more money we spend on anticipation and adaptation, the less money we have to spend on recovery, all right? When we think about anticipation, the things that are falling in there are ability to forecast, early warning systems. How do we get early warnings to people? So one of the examples that came up in the faith consultation was, if you're a poor settlement in a riparian zone or a zone that floods, how do you warn people such that they can get out and that they can take their assets with them? And then where do they go? How do you get them back? And so it takes a lot of planning and thinking, not only also a bunch of sophistication. So our adaptation team at the PCC are working on what's the state of our monitoring, digital monitoring ecosystem. Can we predict extreme weather events and how accurate are we? Adaptation, of course, is what do we change? First prize is let's not build in floodplains. Right? But there are a whole bunch of other things that we have to think about in terms of agriculture and responsiveness. And then, of course, recovery is all about how do you manage the disaster? Where do people go? What kind of emergency response do you need? And what kind of rebuilding do you need? And there are a whole bunch of other very complicated elements that go with that. So, for example, violence against women rises after extreme weather events and other disasters, but also the medical response system is overloaded, and so deprioritize incidences of abuse and rape against women. Right? So you have this kind of double whammy. And so when you're thinking about adaptation and gender and all of this, what do we have to put in place? And so there's a lot of thinking that we have to do, but we just thought this was a useful way to think about all of the different components of resilience and adaptation. Okay. So this is pretty much what the Global Stocktake said. There's some hope in here. So what we've avoided for the actions that we've taken up until now is warming up to 4 degrees. So things are changing. Maybe too slowly, but they are changing. And with the commitments that we've made, we'll be now somewhere between 2.1 and 2.8 degrees, remembering that South Africa warms at twice the global average. So we are heading to somewhere between 4 and 6 degrees of warming. Right? But then they also make the point that there's a huge gap between the mitigation that we have now and our target of 1.5 degrees. And the implication of that for the NDC setting process is collectively, globally, we have to be more ambitious. Right. Another thing to note is no matter what model you look at, UNFCCC models, local models, international models, they all more or less have this general shape, which requires most of the mitigation action, most of the emissions reductions to happen between 2030 and 2040. To this theme of you have to do things now. If you fail to do things now, you just can't meet those targets. Right? And so we're setting an NDC for 2035. So we're setting mitigation goals for 2035. And that's the midpoint of this kind of decade of action. So it's a really critical NDC that we're dealing with now. How are we doing? So this is a slightly complicated chart, but it gives us a sense of what's going on. So in the UAE consensus, in order to stay below 1.5 degrees, it says that we have to globally reduce our emissions by 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035. Against 2019 emissions levels. So if we were to plot those levels against our 2019 emissions, we'd have to get to 271 by 2030 and 191 by 2035. Right? But we're a developing country. So we would expect through common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, right, UNFCCC talk for equity, to be above that line, and we would expect developed countries to be below that line, and on average we kind of come out on the line. Does that make sense? And so the big debate that we are having is how high above the line can we be? Right? And if you consider us as an emitting country, we're in the top 20 emitters globally, both now and historically. And if you adjust for trade, right? So even if you take off the emissions that we've sold to other people and the products we sell them, we're still in the top 20, right? So if you just applied that, we would expect to be below the line. But we also have the highest poverty, inequality, unemployment in the world and a legacy of colonialism and apartheid, right? Which we weight very highly. And so then we would expect to be above the line, but how much above the line? Like there's a little bit of difficulty in kind of finalizing that. And so we are quite far above the line. So our 2025 emission goal is between 398 and 510, and our current 2030 goal is between 350 and 420. right? And currently we're somewhere around here between 420 and 450-ish. So we'll easily get in our 2025 goals. We have to work quite hard to get into our 2030 goals. And currently we are on track for just getting in the top end, maybe missing it with the current actions and policies that we have. And so what we're debating is if we are committed to net zero by 2050, so not absolute zero, net zero, even if we just took straight lines from 420 to net zero and 350 to net zero, our range would be somewhere between 278 and 330. Right? But as you saw from the previous slide, it's not a straight line. It's slightly concave, and so we would expect to be slightly below these points. And if we look at the various models that have been looking at net zero pathways for the country, on the right, the lower end 1.5 compliant bound is 200, according to the JET IP work, and the upper bound for 2 degrees is 390. So if you put that green circle from 200 to 390, that's kind of where we would expect to be from 1.5 to 2 degrees, right? And if you look at the sort of median type numbers, the most commonly tracked numbers, somewhere around 260 to 280. So just below that line, as our thought experiment would say. So we're not saying this is what will be in the NDC. We're just kind of saying this is what the NDC looks like. This is how we can think about it. This is the logic that we can use to get to a range. But we would expect it to be somewhere in that green circle. Makes sense? From a conceptual point of view, what we're basically doing is taking a budget and allocating it across the economy. So how do we allocate the emissions that we can safely emit across different sectors of the economy to maximize socioeconomic outcomes? Right, that's the challenge we face on the mitigation side. So to support all of this, support how we think about this, we have commissioned a bunch of research, as I said, across a range of areas. We've looked at climate modeling, we've looked at air quality, we've looked at trade modeling, we've looked at large-scale economic modeling. We've started to look at how do these macroeconomic impacts play out in communities and provinces and households. It's quite a difficult area to model, but we're improving our work there. We've done a lot of work on energy and transport and finance. Right, just to give us a kind of evidence base. And we've also looked at a whole bunch of work done by others to try to come up with a perspective. One of the modeling pieces we did was with UCT, where you could do a whole range of things. We ran a whole bunch of scenarios, about 40 scenarios. You can have high carbon border adjustments, carbon border taxes. You can have lots of local utilization. You can have different carbon budgets. You could have energy efficiency or not. And we kind of switch these things on and off. And we ran a whole bunch of scenarios, which gives us this chart. So on the bottom axis, you've got carbon budget, in other words, how much carbon you emit into the atmosphere. And then on the vertical axis, we've got GDP per capita, right? And there are a couple of things to note. As you move to a lower carbon budget, you do have a lower GDP per capita because you're accelerating things ahead of the market. So for example, if we want a high electric vehicle take-up, they're not yet at price parity, so you'd probably have to subsidize it a little bit. Right? Soon they will be at price parity, but they're not yet. And so that results in slightly lower GDP per growth. But the thing to note is we're not talking massive differences here. So if you look at some 9 gigaton budgets, it's maybe 10 to 15% difference to the top end. So I think people in their minds think, oh, you're going to have half the growth. It's not the case. The other thing to note is as the carbon budgets get bigger, the economic growth flattens out. And so there is no economic gain for a carbon budget bigger than 10 gigatons. 11, 12, 13, you get the same economic growth, right? And so that kind of provides us with a sort of proxy top end, right? That's our best effort without support on the top end of the NDC range. We can do that. That's what the economies show, least effort, highest return. But there are also some other things that the models don't account for. So if we think about a 10 gigaton budget over time, so these are carbon emissions, GDP per capita over time, it doesn't model things like trade impacts. What happens if the EU or someone else refuses to trade with us because of our emissions? It doesn't model climate impacts, right? And we did some work with Cambridge Econometrics that kind of suggested that the trade impacts could be as much as 6% of GDP by 2030. And the climate impacts could be as much as 5% of GDP by 2030. I think that's conservative to Richard's earlier point. It could be as much as 15 or 20%. So remember those differences between the 10 gigaton budget and the 9 gigaton budget where sort of 10, 15%, they've been eroded just by those two things, right? Air quality, we've done some work with the CSIR. The difference between a low budget and a high budget could cause 2,400 more premature deaths as a result of air quality, not counting productivity losses, right? And of course, there's a whole geopolitical context to all of this. The other way to think about it is a 9 gigaton budget hasn't necessarily factored in things like new business opportunities, manufacturing batteries, manufacturing local renewable energy components, different kinds of mining. Access to preferential finance and access to preferential trade opportunities could actually make the GDP estimate of those lower carbon budgets higher, right? So there's a strong argument to say, well, actually our best effort isn't 10 gigatons, it's 9 gigatons. All right, does that make sense? And that then will translate to specific NDC points. So when we think about mitigation, the other thing we have to think about is equity, right? So to get to 1.5 degrees, and there are a couple of studies, but the numbers are all more or less the same, we have to reduce, we only have 275 gigatons of emissions globally left, right? At the rate we are emitting today, that will be used up by the late 2020s, 2028-ish, right? And so if we were to claim 10 gigatons of that 275, we would be claiming 3.6% of the global budget, right? But if you think about GDP, we only contribute 0.6% to global GDP, and we only contribute 0.8% of global population. So we will be claiming 4 to 5 times more than we currently contribute if we choose 10 gigatons. Is that fair? Well, I don't know. It depends how you weight things like poverty, inequality, and unemployment, right? And so when we think about that equity, we need to be thinking about that as well. In reality, it is unlikely we will stay below 1.5 degrees, right? But we shouldn't then anchor on 2 degrees, which is what people do. Oh, we've missed 1.5, now we must do 2 degrees. Actually, now we must do 1.55, and then 1.6, and then 1.65, and then 1.7, right? And so every little bit of a degree makes a huge difference to the climate impacts. So then we think about means of implementation, right? So these are all of the things that we have to do, and there are huge and big changes to our economy and even our social structure, right? Particularly when we start to think about justice. So what kind of support can we rely on? And so I mentioned in the past, the top end of the NDC is typically thought of as what we will do without support, and the bottom end of the NDC, what we can do with support, right? And so what kind of support do we have? We can think about finance. We can think about capacity building. How do we transfer knowledge and skills? We can think about technology transfer and intellectual property. What technologies are out there, heat pumps, better wind farms, etc. And then we can think about trade. Now, especially in this current geopolitical environment, we cannot expect $100 billion of grant. It's not happening. No one will give us that amount of money. And we are more likely to get that support in debt, whether we like debt or not. And so the key question, and in the example I used, even if you think about your personal budget, taking debt for Edgar's and shop credit cards, bad move, right? Taking debt for property, it's okay. Right? And so how we spend the money is perhaps more important than where it comes from. But obviously there are some big concerns about debt. And so the key issue there is leverage. When we get the support, how do we leverage it to drive domestic spending? That's the key thing, right? And of course, the way we structure that domestic spending must spread benefits to more people, so distributive justice, and must correct historical injustice, so restorative justice, and must include people, procedural justice. And it's quite a lot of money. Estimates vary depending on what they include and what they don't, but we're talking about a lot of domestic money that needs to be spent, and we need to get as high leverage for our international support as possible. Where are we today? A couple of quick observations. So this is work that our finance team did tracking climate finance spending, and you will see we're spending about 136 billion at the moment, way short of what we need to spend. But what is encouraging is most of that spending is coming from domestic sources. Right, so we are mobilizing local spending, and we are leveraging our government spending in an effective way. So these are good signals. On the downside, and it's true globally as well as here, is the majority of our spending is on mitigation. And we're kind of ignoring adaptation. So we have very limited spend on adaptation, which includes things like water and agriculture. And the majority of the spending is clean energy, which is both good, but also we've got to spend in other places like transport and spatial planning and a whole range of other areas. So some positive signs, some negative signs, but that gives you a sense of what's happening today. So that is a very, not as quick as we planned, but quick run through of the capacity building programs that we ran last year. So if you're interested in more detail, please do follow the link that was at the bottom of the invite, or look on our website. It's fairly easy to find, and you can see the full 4-hour version, which goes into a lot more detail that some of the people in the room will be able to tell you. Okay, before we move on, any quick questions or observations? One here? Please use your mic and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for a very technical presentation. I am Tami Matsero from Earth Green. When you explained or talked about what is contained in the NDC or what it should contain, interestingly, I've seen that, or I observed that there is no mention of mainstreaming climate change. We talk only about mitigation and adaptation, but how you integrate or institutionalize it across all sectors, I see you silent, or the presentation was silent on that. Will it be covered somewhere, or is it not maybe an important key strategic area that we can use to also to maybe as a country response towards climate change? And also the other one, I don't know whether maybe they'll be covered in other presentation. I'll reserve them for now, and hope that we'll get to hear about them. But you talked about funding a bit, but you did not tell us about what funding options are already available in the country, and what the civil society can do. Because the truth is, like you said, that climate change disproportionately disadvantage the poor. I'm from around the Ditsogotla region. When we grew up, there were a lot of maize crops. If you go there today, it's just soil erosion. Maize is gone because there's no rain. And there's no rain, we don't have, as communities around that area, we don't have irrigation systems to can help us to irrigate. When I grew up, there were a lot of peach trees, trees with truly with peaches. They are no longer there, peach trees. We don't know what happened to them. When I grew up, my mother, when she does her laundry, there were a lot of butterflies as she does her laundry. And there's a big fabric store, soft, nice, smelling nicely. There'll be different kinds and colorful butterflies around the bathtub. But today, if I try to recreate it, they are no longer butterflies. So it shows that something is happening. And we need to help. We want to participate, but it needs funding. Any action needs funding. So I am also interested in that. So I'm not sure whether it will be covered in other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I guess just to emphasize what we're trying to do here today is we're trying to get your input into what needs to go into the NDC. Not everything you will say will be able to go into the NDC. So the NDC is largely about targets that we set, and the LEDs is about the plan, which would include things like how we're going to fund it, right? But the section on means of implementation allows us to signal what our needs are. Right. So we want to spend most of the today listening to you, so there won't be any more presentations from our side. But the way that we're trying to interpret the comments and the questions that are made is a couple of things here, right? So mainstreaming and institutionalization of climate change is something that needs to be done. So we can build that into the recommendations to say this has to be in the targets and it has to be funded, and therefore in the means of implementation. On your point about, what's come up a lot in the other sections is how do we use people's experiences to understand climate change? What are the local impacts? How do we use Indigenous knowledge to understand the impacts? Those things have to be included. And then, of course, a broader range of funding that actually reaches communities. And what I hear from you, and came up yesterday as well, I mean, on Saturday, we had the youth session on Saturday, is how do we get access to these things? We don't know. Nobody does, right? And so we need some kind of communications platform that helps people access the kinds of resources that they need. So this is basically upfront admission to say we're not going to have answers to all of your questions, but we are listening and we'll try to record them and reflect them in the recommendations that we make as needs, if that makes sense. Another comment there, and then here.
Thank you. I forgot your name. You said your name is?
Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Your presentation for me as a person coming from civil society, and my name is Patrick Mahlakwan from Disabled People South Africa. I think the presentation is too technical for the people that are affected by climate change. More especially, you said poor rural people, disabled people amongst the poor of the poorest. And if we were to get the message across, I think the way the presentations are structured, they are very technical, and we'll get lost along the way. We'll not understand some of these things. We, as disabled persons, were the most affected. If you look at what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal and all that, many disabled people will be unaccounted for. And it will also affect the state in terms of ensuring that persons with disabilities, they are, what do you call it? Their assistive devices will be affected because of the soil erosions. I'm talking about the wheelchairs, and those who are blind will be affected. Yes, it is a good idea that we need to start thinking about how to reduce what do you call it, the emission. However, how will not be able to if we are not getting the awareness to the people. People are now building close to those areas where they're not supposed to build, and they bring their families, and disabled people are also amongst those. So I think for us to be able to achieve or to get somewhere, these presentations need to be simplified so that our organizations, I'm talking more especially about disabled persons, you know, their education level I mean, the education system, it's affecting them because it's not, they are not actually covered when it comes to education. So they will not be able to understand, and for them to be able to participate, somehow we need to get to to their level so that they'll be able to understand. I can understand at this level, there are people who are representing other organizations, but we are the most affected. I'm just saying that maybe simplify the presentation so that all of us can participate equally. Because at the moment, yes, we'll have us attending, but everything that you've been talking about, the numbers, everything, we will not be able to understand. Somehow you'll have to find a way to get to us so that we can participate equally. And so that when we say climate change affect everybody, and when we say there's budget for certain things, we should be able to say, how can we participate as persons with disabilities? I'm not sure whether I make sense, but I feel that it's too technical, it's at a high level, it's reached at a high level, and will not be able to participate as persons with disabilities. Maybe we need to find a way of getting to the poor of the poorest in a rural area, get their feeling in terms of how this thing is affecting them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I mean, that's a very important point. And yeah, this presentation isn't necessarily aimed at those groups, but it is a big challenge, particularly because of the levels of trust required. So by default, you have to simplify all this complexity into something that is accessible, which requires some trust. And that requires longer term relationships. So you can't do that in one session, for example. So we acknowledge those challenges. We acknowledge that we don't have them solved. We are working on some processes that help us engage. Even today, we'll do some exercises that get you to write your opinions on Post-it notes. But if you go into very rural communities, not everybody can read or write. And so even that approach doesn't work. And so I don't want to say we have the problem solved at all, but we understand the problem and we are working on that. But your feedback is important and well noted. Thank you. There was a question here.
Okay, my name is Elizabeth. I think my comment is more or less and the same as the previous gentleman, because according to the title here, it's a civil society consultation process. And for me, yeah, maybe the recommendation is that when you guys present from the presidency, there should be a difference between presenting to the World Bank than presenting to the people on the ground. And for me, in the South African context, the issue of climate change has not yet penetrated the psyche or the psychology of the people on the ground. And these are the people who are suffering the greatest impact. Therefore, I'm really suggesting that the budget be put or be found somewhere where they could really place a lot of emphasis on bottom-up approaches to the whole issue. I mean, there are sophisticated concepts. Some of us may understand, but some of the things we may not be able to understand. We still need to unpack the concept to the population of South Africa. Because when voting time comes, it's not the people with scientific knowledge who determine who governs the country. It's the people on the ground. Therefore, we say make the information accessible, and that should really inform the G20 participation. That should inform us on the ground to say, in my household, how do I adapt? How do I mitigate? In the local context type of situation, how do I adapt? I always make a difference between, the big banks and Capitec. Who's making a greatest impact? It's Capitec, because their language talks to the people on the ground, and they can bring about big, big impacts. If I don't know, if the rain there is flooding, and in my mind, I still say, oh, there was this Mamohashwa snake that passes here in my village. And then I don't associate it to greenhouse gases. I'm not associating to my behavior. The battle will not be won. And I'm saying, I went through the documents. I'm saying also the modeling system is okay. But even that modeling, how you do the modeling for this and that, it really has to talk to the small people. Like, I'm from the small business sector. The business people on the ground, those who are working with energy, those who are doing the buying on the street and so on, how do we change that behavior to say what you are doing may impact your future in this way? Therefore, I'm thinking in terms of rolling out the whole battle against the climate change crisis, let us look at these things from a sociological point of view, scientific point of view, financial point of view, and target our presentation according to the type of response that we as a country needs to build cohesion about fighting the crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just taking some notes. Yeah, I mean, these are both very well made points, and we acknowledge them. The component of procedural justice and how we include people is critical. So we've got maybe last points, because I still want to give the commissioners a chance to comment, and then we're going to have a whole hour and a bit to also discuss these issues in more detail. So we've got 2 points at that table, and then I'm going to hand over to Commissioner Ebdenor.
Thank you. My name is Salome Madiba. I'm a community developer. One thing that I have realized in our country is integration. We are not integrating activities. Department of Education works away from Department of Sports. When you look at communities, for an example, when you look at sport, we see that soccer, we see that rugby, people understand and people love sport. When you look at different clubs, we don't look at them being our agents, key stakeholders to take climate change. And I mean, it's young people also, like for instance, we're talking about the CETAs, we're talking about work for youth, work for women, too abstract. But climate change be so key, wherein youth are coming up with agricultural projects. I mean, communities where we're coming from, youth are doing gardens, food gardens, but we were talking on the way as we were coming here to say, all those small farmers that really put efforts, to do farming last year. As we speak now, there's nothing for them, financially and otherwise. We've been talking about climate change, for a long time. For us, as we are seated here, we don't even understand what climate change is. Taking it like Elizabeth was saying, making it simple language that we can understand. And every day, that's why some people were late. It's part of climate change. Weather Bureau, it's still there, to serve the few. And why don't we use our MTN, our Vodacoms, to say, let's communicate to people. We're talking about AI now. Young people are excited about AI, but there's a separation, or there'll always be a separation between technical issues for young people, for youth, as well as scientific language.
for universities, for technicals. So for me, it's the fact that we become too academic and technical without even looking at opportunities to say, we don't have to come up with a budget for this. We have to integrate. A lady who started to give input was talking about mainstreaming. How do we make sure that there's integration and not, repetition of activities? Thank you.
Thank you. Last point, which I'll come back to you if it's okay.
Pongile Nene, from Global Women's, Rural Women's Movement, but also having a trust.
Sorry, can you get a bit closer to the mic so that people can hear you online?
Working with a rural trust that's delivering a game park, working with schools, working with rural people. I'm a rural girl. That's where I grew up. She talked about flowers, butterflies, and so on. Even frogs are gone in rural areas. But also, even here in the urban areas, what I've noticed in my neighborhood is just lack of awareness of how people handle the environment. The gardeners will dump what they sweep in the streets right into the gullies where waters should be flowing. And urban people will be shocked to find that they are flooded, but their gardeners or they themselves are dumping waste into the gullies. In rural areas, we've got schools that need to be educated about climate change. KZN in particular, it's a dramatic scene. But what I have noticed is that the traditional leaders in rural areas are not educated about floodlines. They are settling people in floodplains. And this is critical because tragically, I have noticed where I operate very expensive homes built on floodlines, wetlands. So I think I support what Elizabeth and the gentleman there were saying, bring the information down to where it belongs, to the people who are affected by this and who will really add value, whether as households, as schools, as rulers, governors of such areas. I will really plead for integration of these sectors of our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, those are very important and very helpful. We've taken notes of those. And just to kind of let you know the process that we're running, so we are transcribing everything that's said, and we will be recording all of the comments that you make, and it will influence all of the work of the PCC that we do, even if it doesn't particularly make it into the NDC recommendations. But things like this around integration and inclusiveness will definitely make it in. So I'm going to pause the comments here, if that's okay. The next part of the agenda is for the commissioners who are your representatives. So civil society nominate 4 commissioners, and they are online. And so each of them will make a short input just describing their perspective based on their engagements with their constituency, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and spend some time talking to each other. So thank you. I really appreciate your input so far. And I'm going to quickly hand over to Mr. Abdenor, who's a commissioner from the Center for Environmental Rights, for his quick input. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be quick because I think the voices in the room are more important than mine to hear. But just to say that, yeah, my comrade Mbali, when she opened this morning, was just highlighting the kind of geopolitical mess that we find ourselves in, and that is very relevant for this process. We are seeing an assault on human rights. We're seeing much of the progress being made in terms of creating a more just world. Being eroded and being assaulted and moving backwards, and that includes gender, racial justice, equality, and climate justice is in there as well. We've obviously seen the White House administration pull out of the Paris Agreement. And it's not just problematic from the point of view of that one country doing this. It really acts as a sort of a cheerleader for that sentiment, which exists in nearly all the countries to some degree or another, and starts to create a broad-based pushback against the kind of action that we need. And in this sense, climate response is being used like a political football. And that happens here at home as well. We see a lot of movement around the decommissioning of coal plants. We know that that needs to be done in a careful manner with the right timing. But we are seeing a backsliding, and from a climate perspective and from a social justice perspective, and even from an economic and electricity price perspective, it doesn't make sense to, just keep moving back and keeping really a very ultimately predominantly old and expensive fleet going when there are better alternatives. We're seeing the state still fighting back against the right to build new coal power. We're seeing a huge amount of gas to power applications in the pipeline, something like between 14 and 16,000 megawatts, and a lot of exploration of fossil fuels, both onshore and offshore. So I would suggest that the time for strong climate leadership is possibly the need has never been bigger than now. It was mentioned that this is the decade of action. So we know that a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction work needs to be done now. As Steve said, 43% by 2030, 60% by 2035. And we can't afford to have this competitive brinkmanship between countries. Yes, there needs to be fair share. Absolutely. We know that historical responsibility is a really important factor. But then even when we apply those fair share, really everyone needs to do something. So we need to see the ambition, and we need to see it really strongly at this point in time. So from that perspective, we would like to see the NDC, the next round of NDCs, reflecting that scientific need to reduce emissions at those levels. I think the NDC, it's obviously a target. It's also a roadmap of sorts, a high-level one, but it needs to be more than that. I think it's not going to help us to see this purely as something that is done to fulfill an international obligation. That is an important reason, but it's our own obligation as the state, as the country as a whole, to protect life and livelihoods, and to pivot the economy to one that benefits more people and doesn't wreck the climate, because the costs of those impacts when they go wrong are going to be exorbitant, beyond what any economy can actually manage. I think, and Mbali said this as well, is an opportunity. We need to put the targets in the NDC, but it's also an opportunity to describe how we do that. And I think to center the just transition is critically important. I think those of us that work in the space are dealing with the challenges of how to usher in a just transition on a daily basis, and that can feel overwhelming. And I think all of us at some point in time can feel a bit lost, or we're not sure how we're going to achieve this big thing. But interesting, when we talk to people from other parts of the world, whether they're funders or other role players within the climate space, they often see South Africa as being sort of a leading example around just transition. So we should continue in that vein. The lessons that we'd learned looking into Komati, which not even really a just transition incident, so to speak, but how do we weave some of those important things, those three justices that Mbali mentioned, how do we weave that into the NDC? Because if we get the just transition right, then the rest happens. Then I think some of the speakers raised this really important point, the the psychology is not penetrated to the people on the ground. And I would suggest that the psychology is also not penetrated even at very high state decision-making levels and in business boardrooms. So we need to see that happening more. And if we get the just transition part right, where the different stakeholders in society come together and come to agreements on how to do some of these things, then a lot of the rest will flow. Also, just the need to strengthen the adaptation side of things. I mean, we all, as a country, had a big wake-up call in 2022 around the floods in eThekwini and around. And we're reading about and hearing about this happening this very last weekend again. So that's not an accusation to suggest that anyone's sitting on their hands, but the truth is we're not necessarily making the urgent progress we need in climate-proofing infrastructure, in ensuring the safety of lives, livelihoods, and communities. Steve, Chair, I think I'm going to leave it at that. Very happy to continue getting involved, but I think from a high level, it really is a time to exhibit leadership by being ambitious. And, you know, unless we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, the rest just becomes unattainable. So that is really the keystone. But to really move forward in ensuring that just transition is brought front and center in all this decision making, and that we really move around adaptation. And just last quick word on the finance. I think a lot of the finance that we hope for, and a lot of the grants and that are not going to come. I think that's a sad and scary reality, and that doesn't mean we mustn't continue to fight for it. The global north owes the global south a climate debt. That's a fact. But where else can we get the resources necessary to do this work? We see, for example, 2 states in the USA, which is seen as a bit of a climate villain, but obviously it's a big and complex country. So Vermont and New York State, for example, are levying funds against emitters. So those that profit out of creating the emissions are basically getting taxed in a sense, and that money then gets used to do the adaptation, to make the repairs from the damage. So we need to be thinking out the box in terms of where that sort of money can come from. And definitely agree, we should also look at what we can do with the resources that we have at the moment. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that last point, I mean, a lot of very helpful points in there, but that last point about us as South Africans needing to be innovative and how we resource this, I think is really key, as well as the focus on adaptation. As we saw in the finance slide, there's insufficient focus there. So thank you very much for that input. Mr. Peak, can I ask you to come in next?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Mbali. Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, Steve, I both you and Brandon spoke about the economy, and you specifically said, designing our economy to be able to deal with the challenges we face. And, we know that between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius impacts will rise exponentially. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change special report on 1.5 made that 2 degree of warming and made it very clear that that will be disastrous. And it said that rapid and far-reaching changes to the economic system are needed to keep temperature down. And as the economy is the discussion here, and as I said, I'm glad you started with that. It's that we have to recognize and emphasize this means an economy for people and not for profits. And our present NDC says a just transition means leaving no one behind, but with no transition at all, and 60% of our country in poverty, people are already left behind by the existing economic system. And poverty and inequality have increased since 1994. And climate change is making this worse. And when I hear of people speaking about the fact that butterflies and frogs are no more in the rural areas, those are the realities we face. There's a variety of whole lot of impacts. And we need to recognize that that mitigation and adaptation are one thing. You can't adapt if you're continually destroying the land that you need to adapt. I mean, it just doesn't work. So I just want to say give a couple of final pointers with regards to what are the demands that should be, brought into the updated NDC. These were from previous demands that we made as groundwork and the community organizations and people we work with, but I think it's important here now, considering that we are in a crisis. And Durban has flooded over the last 2 weeks twice, not once, twice. So we have to stop all new fossil fuel exploration and extraction, including coal, oil, and gas developments, stop investment in new coal, oil, and gas infrastructure that leaves us with stranded assets, and reduce existing oil and gas production now. We have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero as soon as possible. Our fair share says that, we're sitting at 305 million tons CO2 in 2035. Today you presented some slides that could take us below 300, and that's important. And that's what we must do. Should we do with our own resources is really important. However, we have to reduce to below 200 million tons in order that we deal with this historic problem, the fact that the North has burnt more than its fair share. And that difference, is a process of discussing financial and other transfers. But I think we need to, and we've said this in the Commission as commissioners, what do we do now with our own resources? We need to recognize that South Africa similarly owes a climate debt to the rest of Africa, and that the rich in South Africa owe a climate debt to the poor. I think it's important that we do not participate in Article 6 of the market mechanisms, and we must stop relying on carbon trading and offsets. They are false solutions that allow polluting companies to continue polluting, and they are expensive and require vast amounts of land that we do not have. It is better to leave the carbon in the ground and invest in clean energy technologies. We must stop promoting the narrative of clean coal. It is an oxymoron. And we must stop saying that fossil gas is clean. It is dirty and dangerous. Methane gas emissions are underreported, and methane is 84 times more powerful than greenhouse gas emissions than CO2. We have to increase renewables by 6 gigawatts a year, and we have to focus on socially owned renewable energy, not privatized energy. We need to commit to clean energy production that is accessible and affordable, and which creates new jobs and supports local manufacture for a sustainable and just future for all. We need to commit plans and funding to support energy workers' transition into new sectors. We need to restore the land, unrehabilitated mines and lands burnt by high input agriculture make adaptation impossible. Agroecological approaches restore carbon in the soil and work for mitigation and adaptation. This must be accompanied with redistribution of land and water rights. And we have to end all lobbying policies, procurement, and adverts that obstruct climate solutions. As Groundwork, Earthlife, and the Center for Environmental Rights, and the community groups we work with on the ground, we have an open agenda for just transition. And we hope that that is considered in the NDCs, because it is about fixing up townships. It is about better services. It is about meeting the commitments that we were promised in the Constitution in 1994. And finally, we need to also recognize that there has to be, and there already has been a discussion, and thanks for clarifying it, that we need to break through technical jargon and we need to engage with people on the ground. And it's good that the DFFE will be doing that. we look forward to that. And finally, I just want to say that, you know, we need to recognize that Komati has been a challenge. It was never decommissioned in a just way. It was closed. It was not decommissioned. But we have to be able to learn from that bad experience so that when we start the decommissioning processes of the other coal-fired power stations, we need to start it now. Even if they're going to decommission in 2030 or 2040, we cannot leave it to the eve of those dates. So learn from Komati and make sure that the decommissioning of the oil refineries, of the coal-fired power stations are started now and not on the eve of them closing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Peake. A number of very important points there. I think also just an emphasis that this transition is not just about coal and power, it's economy-wide. And so he mentioned a number of power things, but also talked about oil and gas and the implications that that would have for transport. And I really enjoyed the focus on an economy for people and not for profits. I heard it, we read a very interesting report the other day that suggested in modeling, instead of optimizing for economic outputs like GDP, we start outputting things like human interaction. So very helpful. Thank you, Commissioner Peake. Okay, so our next commissioner is Commissioner Nordia. If you wouldn't mind giving us your input, please.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to address you. I want to say that we are in a fight for our lives. And, you know, all around the world, we see the shift to the right wing, which comes along with less action on climate change, less participation in multilateral forums like the UN, United Nations Climate Forum. And domestically, we are seeing enormous pushback from companies who are heavy emitters on increasing our emissions reductions. They do not want the targets in the NDC to be improved upon the last NDC. So, you know, there are very few players in society who stand up for the rights of the people. And basically, it is civil society organizations. So you have an enormous responsibility to, you know, to stand up for these things. And part of participating today, we thank you for that commitment. And please translate that into participation in the Department of Environment's consultations and written submissions. So I want to pick up on a few points that you might want to consider in your inputs. The one is the issue of gender. Our Just Transition framework that the Presidential Climate Commission developed, and you know, I was part of that, so I'm responsible for it as much as anyone else, is weak on gender. So we need to really think through and, you know, what is gender justice in a just transition? And the Commission is making some attempt to think about that, but ideas from you will really be helpful. Then I want to repeat what Bobby said about the targets that you could consider advocating. It's based on something called the Climate Equity Reference Calculator, which is used by civil society in its advocacy at the UNFCCC. Civil society brings out this climate equity review every year, which evaluates, you know, is what countries are doing or promising to do adequate to their responsibility for climate change. And that tool, the Climate Equity Reference Calculator, gives us this range. It says that South Africa unconditionally, in other words, without calling for financial or other support from developed countries, South Africa's commitment should be 305 megatons in 2035. So just remember that number. And then with support from other countries to go down even further to 200 megatons. So I think that that might be a very useful advocacy point for us as civil society to rally around. Then I will just call for us to build unity. Because when we speak with one voice, we are really powerful. So there are different networks that work on climate justice. There is SACAN, the South African Climate Action Network. There is the Climate Justice Coalition. There is Commissioner Peake spoke about the Life After Coal Campaign Collective. And all of these are important, and there might be some differences amongst them. There might be that we can't all agree to everything, but I really think we can unite around some common calls for change and common advocacy for the NDC. And we can also find allies, I think that there needs to be far greater engagement and unity between the climate justice organizations and the social justice organizations, because climate change is a social issue. Yeah, and then I think our, comrades in labor organizations are important allies. These are the workers that are our cousins, our brothers and sisters. Some of them are in the fossil fuel industry, and we must make sure, as Bobby said, that we do a just transition so that they are not left behind. This country was built off the back of those workers. Let us not abandon them now. And others are in other sectors, and every single sector is going to be impacted by climate change or by the transition to a lower carbon economy. And so, we really need to join hands with comrades in labor. I think that's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Nadia. Yeah, some very important points there about unity and ambition. So thank you very much for that. So our last speaker before we take a break is Mr. Errol Mhlambo, who represents Grassroots for Climate Action. And we are fortunate that he's here with us today. So if you'd like to come forward and speak from the podium, we'd be very grateful. Thank you. I think we just, there we go. The mic's on. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. No, thank you. You can see everybody was speaking from their comfort, from wherever they are, and I'm brought to the podium, but it's okay. Thank you very much, Steve. All right, I'm Andy Mhlambo from the Grassroots for Climate Action. We are a forum that is facilitated by AdLife Africa, Johannesburg. So we have representatives from Limpopo, in certain areas of Limpopo, certain areas in Gauteng, and certain areas in Gqeberha. So I come here to represent G4CA. When I walked in here and I saw, a lot of familiar faces from the civil society space, it gave me confidence. And when I heard the comments earlier on, it showed that, as civil society, we're in the right track, and we do understand these issues. And I just wanted to add on my reflections that, and again, to start, let's acknowledge the PCC, because previously civil society groups were not invited to speak on high-level discussions like this. like the NDCs. So I commend the work by the PCC. Thank you very much. So to start, we must, as the speakers were speaking earlier on, recognize the lives that have been lost in KZN and other areas, And I saw on the news this morning, I think the number now, they said it's in 20, and it's a tragedy, it's a real tragedy. And then if you were to ask the people who are affected in that area about the NDCs, I think they will not tell you what are the NDCs. So it tells you that we must shift on our conversation, move from making it technical to be more, people-based, using the I and AP, principle of interested and affected parties. We bring them forward so that they can speak up on the climate issues and then give solutions where they can, because we are talking about people and their lived experiences, Myself, coming from a high-felt priority area in Ekurhuleni, where there's high pollution, we've had this discussion as a group and speak to different people. You will find that they don't understand what the NDCs, and NDCs speak to the mitigation part of it. And coming from a high-felt priority area, we are there at the front line to say, if you're going to cut the emissions and you're going to do submissions, what is happening in Ekurhuleni? So if you're going to have that, but have the people not understanding what the NDCs, it means it's going to be minimal input from the people on the ground. So I just wanted to speak on my reflections and give a solution from the perspective of G4CA. What is needed, that we think, very importantly, is to create awareness. That's what's missing. Not enough awareness is created around the NDCs, mitigation, adaptation, and climate change. People on the ground don't know. And these are the people who are frontline, who are impacted every day. People are losing their lives. There's a lot of disruptions. Like the lady was saying earlier on, a lot of people were late today. We are also late due to the climate change because of what's happening. So we need to create more awareness. And I took it upon myself, to show, just to look at the history of our country regarding awareness. Because over time, as a country, we have proved to be a resilient people. And just to show, with awareness strategies, how we've come far. Through history, if you look at firstly, with the democratic elections, the first one in 1994, remember it was clouded with gender and racial suffrage. People could not vote. But when it came the dawn of democracy for people to vote, what was the first thing that was done by the IEC? It was to create awareness and voter education, to let the people know. And what did they use? They use CBOs and NGOs. It's there, it's in our history, to educate people, to create awareness of how important the elections are, and to know, if you vote, the impacts of such. So we must learn, because those people there at that time, they were doing the heavy lifting. There was no social media, but the CBOs went on the ground. They were doing door to door to go and create an awareness and educate people about voting, the importance of voting, and those who are voting for the first time. And secondly, we had the HIV pandemic. If you remember, the same thing again. There were foot soldiers, activists on the ground, doing the heavy lifting, no social media. They were doing door to door to create an awareness, to say, we cannot solve all our problems through government, but it's a collective effort. So we saw that people were going around creating an awareness, and that's how we got solutions that came to combat that pandemic. And then recently we had the COVID pandemic. And now, luckily, we have social media. But the key to that, it was creating awareness. It was important for government to create awareness. And it was there. We saw you need not have known or met someone who has lost their lives through COVID for you to know to wear a mask. You did not have met someone who's lost their life, or you yourself being impacted directly, to sanitize your hands. But through the awareness, that became part of the collective effort to fight the scourge of COVID-19. It was not through only vaccinations that we were able to fight it. So awareness is key to that. And then it brings me to the point of, there's a writer, Cormac Cullinan. He writes in a book called Law. He speaks about the less from people in nature. And I just want to share that. He speaks about a process called embryology. So what that is, simple, is speaking about the fetus, how the fetus develops over time for 9 months to have a human being born. So he goes on to say, there's different stages to to the pregnancy, to the 280 days of gestation, which is trimesters, simple language. He says, if you look at a problem in that way, to say in the next 9 months, in the 290 days, what interventions can you do collectively? Then he goes on to say, for instance, in the beginning, it will be your hormones. Your body will tell you something is not okay. Secondly, you'll go to the medical practitioner, which is a science now. They will inform you that this is what's happening to your body. This is how you must take care of your body. Then the third part will be your family traditions. You know, every family will tell you, maybe in your family, you must not walk barefooted, you must not eat this, you change how you approach your diet. And then the indigenous language, the indigenous knowledge will come to play to say, these are maybe the remedies you must take. And collectively, after 9 months, then the baby is born. That's a solution. But it's different interventions from different people at different times. So it's important that we consider in approaching the NDCs that at different phases, we must involve different people. Science must work with the people. Science must work with traditions. Science must work with indigenous people, indigenous cultures, our traditions. It's very important that we help that, we work with it. Because just a week ago, we're having a Just Transition Framework dialogue in Venda. So it was my second time going to Venda, but what I noticed and I observed, I would like to share. So as you are driving through Venda, you see the green that is there, the carbon sink that is there. You know, the mountains are covered with green. It was so beautiful. But to know that, do those people know the role they're playing in reducing the carbon emissions? It's very important. And they're using indigenous knowledge to preserve those sites. We can take a lot of learnings from the people in that side to bring them here so that when we are submitting on the NDCs, we can say, we also can rely on indigenous knowledge to say, these are the measures that they're taking to preserve their biodiversity and to keep it going. I mean, the air there is very fresh. I don't know if you've been there. Anyone who's been there can attest to this. So these are the things that we must look at. And then on the last point is that when we're talking about the NDC, they are saying the NDCs are not legally binding. But as a matter of opinion, I think on a national level, maybe for the UNFCCC, they might not be binding. But for us here, nationally, I think they are binding because we do have Section 24 of our Constitution. We can hold our government to account to say, you must prioritize the NDC. There must be binding because if you're going to have all these high emitters, energy-intensive companies just emitting, saying these are not binding, meaning they can give us false numbers and use cost accounting. I mean, we learned with the polluters must pay principle that if the more we push it, the polluter agrees to pay, then they come back and they incorporate the cost back to the end user again. So we must look at those things to say, you know, we do have means to address and challenge the NTC not to be non-legally binding, but to be legally binding. So we can force the corporate, we can force government, we can force the corporates to really take the NTC seriously because lives are being lost as we're speaking. Things are happening. The next thing when we're done here, we can find that there's more lives being lost in KZN. So we must not treat this issue as an issue of isolation or a high level issue. So that's I needed to share that. And then just to add, for us at the high-felt priority areas, we are saying it's not fair that when lives are lost, we start the conversation about spluma. I heard earlier in the comments to say, but why are people living in areas that are, you know, low-lying, floodlines? It is a valid conversation, and I agree. However, now it's a little bit too late to go back to that. Now it's time for us to do immediate intervention. We must call for the intervention right now to say, whenever there's submissions like this ones of the NDCs, we want the collaborations to be like this. You bring civil society here, you bring people with indigenous knowledge so we can come together and move forward. I would like to thank you very much. I'll end here.
Important points there. In particular, I love this metaphor of evolution of interventions over time as we learn both from the science and from local communities, indigenous knowledge. And I think something that came up that reflects beautifully a conversation we also had faith sector is to reflect on what is our agency as a stakeholder group. And so how does civil society play a part in the simplification of this technical message and building capacity amongst people? So I think some excellent input there. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to take two quick comments online, and I think there's a question online. Simpiwe, are you going to be able to share that with us? And then I think there's one hand online, and I know that Richard had his hand up in the room, so we'll take Richard's questions and then we'll break for tea. Thank you. Over to you, Simpiwe.
Okay, good morning, everyone. The first comment is from Ellen. I'm sorry if I butcher your surname, Basa Jasubi. So there's he or she expresses gratitude. So excuse me, that's not what he said. So he or she wants to ask if we can let them know what we need from the people on the ground. But I think that also ties in with what Errol has just said around agency from the people on the ground. And then he goes on to say, I mean, on a very practical level, the questions you want answers to, how commitments can be made more generally, and if you have a booklet you can use. So this is around information dissemination. And so he says he's asking from a civil society organization because we can use our channels to put out the information. And with regards to climate finance, there really needs to be spent on climate change education and awareness raising. There's another comment from Natalie Jones, thanking you for the presentation. And she's a policy advisor from IASD. And the question is around South Africa's JET-IP. There's many positive elements regarding mine closure and rehabilitation, supporting workers and communities, economic diversification, and so on. What we have seen in the strongest NDCs so far, like the United Kingdom, is that they don't only contain targets, but also the surrounding policies and measures that make those targets viable. Just energy transition is one of the most important prerequisites of mitigation. So she would be grateful to hear some thoughts on whether it is possible to reflect these in the NDCs. That's all. There's two hands now.
Okay, excellent. So, I mean, a quick response to that is, you know, the NDC is a very challenging document to write. It is the targets that we reflect to the UNFCCC. It can't be 200 pages. Right? Typically, it's like 10 to 15 pages. And certainly we want our recommendations to be accessible to also be very short. But it doesn't mean that all of these points about integration are not valid. And so I think how we think about, and it's why we had that slide right at the beginning, is what is the domestic environment? You know, there are a whole bunch of other areas where this needs to be reflected. Our energy planning needs to be aligned. Our transport planning needs to be aligned. Our spatial planning that was mentioned needs to be aligned. And so I can't directly answer your question. There's definitely room for some of this in how we draft the NDC and how we draft the recommendations to the NDC, but we're definitely not going to be able to include everything. But as I say, everything will be recorded. So the reports that we will produce, we're going to produce 3 reports. One is the formal recommendations. We need that to be short and punchy so that people read it. That will be backed by a longer, more technical report that will deal with all of the technical issues raised, as well as some of the research that we've been exploring. And then there will be a stakeholder consultation report that will reflect all of the things that you've raised with us and that you've asked about, and that also the other social partners have asked about. And so there's this kind of record. And then, as I said earlier, the stakeholder record will not only influence our NDC work, but our other work. So the work that we do on gender, the work that we do with working with local communities, the work that we do on implementation, all of that will take into account what you say going forward. That's, you know, so we have this multiple objective of engaging with you today. Okay, we're going to take a question from Richard in the room, and then I think there are 2 questions online, and then we're going to break for tea. You've been very patient, so much appreciated.
Thanks. You've largely answered my question, but I do want to put a bit of context that I was going to use for it. You also said that in faith it came up, what is our role within the NDC process? And so bearing in mind that the NDC is of strategic significance internationally and nationally. And as Commissioner Naudé has pointed out, there are those very powerful forces within South Africa that are only too happy to see the likes of Trump in the White House and take that as an excuse and basis to push back against what we already have in the NDC that we have tabled for 2030. You yourself have acknowledged that it is possible we may be missing the upper range of our target for 2030. I think we need to acknowledge that in this context, we have the likes of Business for South Africa, the Black Business Council, certain players within Eskom and beyond that are actively trying to deconstruct what we've developed so far by way of our climate change response. And in particular, that the moves going on in the electricity sector at the moment could single-handedly utterly seriously derail and undermine not just our climate change response, but sustainable development in general. And a lot of what we've heard today is stuff that government should be doing in the name of sustainable development anyway. We don't necessarily need to have all of this stuff, as you've said, in our nationally determined contribution to the international community. And it's really good to hear that these inputs will be taken forward through other processes because they're very relevant to the sectoral emissions targets work that is ongoing. So I think the PCC at the moment is having to deal with a situation where the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment is egregiously lacking in its communications and outreach. And therefore, a lot of expectation comes to the PCC, including to this particular process for something which is an international commitment first and foremost. Yes, it must speak to our international conditions, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we are in an existential battle here with the short-term profiteers who are trying to derail a just energy transition. And therefore, that we need to be mindful in our inputs to this process that we are not only speaking to the big, broad needs, but also targeting our responses to address those forces within our society and within our government that are trying to disable attempts at a reasonable response to the challenges of climate change. And just to conclude on that, all that's being done under our electricity sector still neglects getting electricity to the people. And if we're going to adapt to climate change, everybody must have access to modern communications. That means everybody must have access to electricity. That's the kind of framing thing we can put in our NDC, but obviously needs to play out through a whole lot of other processes nationally. But we need to hang on to this international process and our targets for 2035 if we are to keep any chance of a just transition for South Africans and our region. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's quickly take the two questions online. I don't know if Bridget, you can help me, or the two hands online. Are there still hands up?
I don't see any hands.
Okay. All right, well, if you did have your hand up online and you want to come in again after the break, please do. And we're going to take a quick break now. So we have tea and coffee outside where we had this morning. Hello?
Sorry, there's two Q&As.
Okay.
So maybe those are the hands.
I see.
I think those are the ones that were dealt with by Simpiwe before the break.
All right. Well, we'll clarify over the break if there's anyone that needs more input from online. And we've got one question in the room, which we will kick off with when we come back. Is that okay? Or do you want to do it now? Thank you. When we come back. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, I want to give you a break because I know it's been a long initial session. Thank you for your input so far. It's been fascinatingly interesting. I already have several pages of notes. So yeah, please have a break. There's tea and coffee across the way. If we can be back at past, please. So we'll take 15 minutes. I know I'm supposed to give you half an hour, but begging your indulgence, and then we'll come back and we will do some more discussion and some exercises, and then break for lunch on time. So thank you very much so far. Enjoy your tea break, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you. Okay, if we can start making our way back, please. Okay. So we've got an hour and a half left, and we want to maximize the opportunity to engage with you. And so we're going to do a combination of kind of plenary discussions as well as some exercises. So we had one comment in the room at the front, and if there's anybody else that would like to say anything before we start the exercises, please prepare yourself. But sir, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Mine is a comment, a question and a comment. I just wanted to find out from the PCC.
Sorry, please don't forget to introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Motwa Kumalo from G4CA, from Climate Action Group, from Tembisa. And my question is to the PCC. I'm trying to find out the mechanisms that are there between the PCC and departments of state. If there is a direct link with the department, or the PCC only has a link with the president solemnly, there's an exclusive kind of an arrangement. The reason I'm asking that is that there seem not to be a similar understanding of the realities on the ground in terms of climate issues. Last week we had a webinar there was a presentation that was done by the DDG of DMR, which I don't think if he had had the opportunity to read the framework on just energy transition, you would have made that presentation the way it was done. And there were some couple of experts that were with him. So I wanted to find out from the PCC that does the PCC have institutional arrangements with departments so that information is shared so that we can read from the same hymn book. And then the other thing is, it's a suggestion that I believe collaboration works far much better than confrontation. The departments, their approach in service delivery is confrontational, as instead of us coming from civil society to be seen as people who can contribute, they see us as angry people who want to distract. We are not angry. We live in the same vicinity with everybody, and we have solutions that we want to share. So my suggestion would be, let's change the attitude of confrontation and then begin to build collaborations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that last point is very close to the hearts of the PCC. I often describe us as serial collaborators. We'll collaborate with anyone. I love that suggestion. On your question, There are informal direct links, if that makes sense. Our formal partnership, or our formal role is to provide independent advice. And so we don't have, for example, with the DFFE process that they're running on the NDC, we are giving them our advice and they will use it or not use it depending on what they think is important. But we often work on things together. We help to, so for example, we co-hosted the consultation session prior to COP. So in developing our COP mandate, we brought stakeholders together and they did the sort of speaking and the arranging. So I think there are areas where we partner and there are areas where we stay a little bit more arm's length, and the NDC is one of those. We're a little bit more arm's length, but we partner on a range of things with different government departments at different levels. But it's our formal role is independent advisory, and so we don't do implementation. We just provide this kind of advice that's independent. So not a very helpful answer, but that's the state of it. Okay, any other comments or questions in the room? Okay, we've got one online. Okay, thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks. It's Janet Cherry here from Nelson Mandela University. I don't represent a civil society organization as such, but represent the university working in the Transition Township project, which is really concerned with Nelson Mandela Bay and both mitigation and adaptation in terms of industry and the auto industry, transport sector, and so on. And my question, it's a question and a little bit of an input, is related to industrial policy in particular, and what was raised in terms of sectoral emission target sets, which are legally binding. And what is the process by which those targets are set, and specifically in relation to manufacturing and the auto industry sector, transport, but also it refers to other sectors of the economy where I think there are significant opportunities in terms of reduction of carbon emissions. And I'm thinking about the debate around the green hydrogen industry and how that can contribute to agriculture in terms of fertilizer, in terms of construction industry, in terms of cement, and industrial policy, obviously transport in terms of fuel and in terms of general auto industry and the green mineral value chain, how this relates to regional policy and cooperation with SADC in terms of the green mineral value chain, and where this comes into this process of setting of targets. And just, I mean, one point I wanted to raise was just in response to Brandon's input, which I think was very important. I mean, he was indicating that from the side of the government, we need really decisive leadership and we need hard choices to be made. So we can't do everything. I mean, well, I'm not us. I mean, I'm not talking about civil society here. I'm talking about the policy, what we are committed to. So we can't at the same time commit to promoting socially owned renewable energy, which is what was mentioned by one of the other commissioners, Bobby Peake, which I'm working in that area, which we should clearly support that initiative. But we can't do that at the same time as promoting the development of offshore oil and gas, new development of shale gas, new support for coal-fired power stations, export of coal to Israel, etc., etc. So I think what I'm saying is that I want to ask, where does this setting of these industry or sector targets happen, and how can we give input into that process? I think it's really important. And where are these hard choices made? Because if Department of Environmental Affairs is the one that determines the NDC, the NDC targets that are set, how does this relate to industrial policy, to mining, mineral and energies, to the auto industry, to different departments in government? Thanks. And by the way, I just want to say, I fully support the inputs from Bobby Peake and Louise Nordi and Brandon and the other Mr. Mlambo about the focus of our NDC. Thanks.
Brilliant, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, you raise a really important point, and the OECD recently released a report, or in fact, I think it's still in draft, talking about what is an NDC in its context, right? And because it has big implications for how you design the economy, it's actually not a conversation that can happen in one department. That was kind of their core recommendation. And in fact, you need to be having this conversation across a whole range of implementing and policy departments, which I think is what you're getting at, Janet. And so the core cluster of policy that relates to climate and how it impacts the economy are the sets. So these are the locally binding sectoral targets, and beneath those are company level budgets that then also contribute to achieving the sets. And then of course you have the NDC itself, which is kind of what are we aiming at, and then how you get there is driven in the low emissions development strategy and the parallel national development plan. Now, of course, there are, as you point out, there are conflicts and sort of points that don't align in our policy framework, and that is a challenge, and that is not abnormal. That happens everywhere around the world. What we're doing is undergoing this massive transition, and some of the policy has to catch up, and some of the mindset has to catch up, and so on. And so it's very important. It's a very important point that we can't just consult on the NDC. We have to be thinking about all of these other parallel policy processes that build into transitioning our economy. There was a specific question about the sets. So governments have proposed through the DFFE particular sets for each sector, and they are, I think, have just closed the consultation on that. But those were the sets for the 2025, 2025 to 2030 program. So they are the targets to help us achieve our 2030 goals. And we are currently, we will have to begin consulting on the 2030 to 2035 sets that support the targets we set in this 2035 NDC process. And then reform of all of the other policy that needs to happen in order for us to achieve that. So the contradiction you point around social ownership in renewables and building offshore oil and gas, like that is potentially a contradiction, and we have to somehow resolve. So sort of answered your question in terms of this is specifically the consultation process on sets. And so the sort of policy, the Climate Act states that the DFFE minister will allocate the sets in consultation with the line departments. And of course, the line departments are setting their own policies. So for example, the IRP, and so the IRP needs to align with the sets, which needs to align with the NDC. And if we're honest, at the moment, these policies do not align. And so there's quite a lot of work to do there. But Janet is one of our kind of thinking partners around social ownership and township development. So thank you for dialing in, Janet. Okay, we have a comment here and then at the back. Please go ahead. Please remember your mic so people online can hear you.
At the grassroots level of small-scale farmers, I've heard a lot of emphasis on adaptation in terms of climate change. Now I want to find out, what does the NDC advise people on the grassroots? What are the adaptation actions that they can take? Because we had a low output with produce because of climate change. We've got problems with water because the seasons are not running the way we know them to supposed to be doing. So I would like to know what are the strategies that we must do on the ground to sort of adapt to this climate change and also be able to have enough produce to provide food for our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a great question to kind of highlight the challenge we have in drafting the NDC recommendations. A topic of particular interest to local governments in Friday's session was waste. And everybody has a sort of important thing, and they're all important, but the NDC is not specifically going to deal with all of them. And so I think the opportunity for the NDC is for us to raise those things that are important. For example, small-scale agriculture and access to adaptive responses and resources. Right? How do we fund it? How do we build skills? How do we raise awareness? All of these things that have come up. I doubt it's going to be reflected in that level of detail in the NDC document itself. But what we want to be able to establish is priorities and goals. So one of the goals that we could include in the NDC is that small-scale farmers and rural farmers have access to resources and protection from extreme weather events. I don't know how we'll phrase it, but something like that. And then that puts an onus on other government departments and policymakers to start developing policy in line with that goal. That makes sense. And so what's important for us to hear from you today, even if you don't think it's that important for an NDC, is to tell us about it. And as I say, this will kind of then reflect in some of our other programs, but it also gives us an opportunity to start thinking about what are the institutional and policy environment things needed to make that happen. And therefore kind of resourcing and so on. And it won't be perfect. The idea of the NDC is that you improve every 5 years. So we'll go from the previous NDC to your question about what does it say about adaptation rural agriculture. The previous NDC was much more of a plan for a plan, if that makes sense. We need these resources in order to plan properly and to understand the problem properly, not necessarily reflecting on the actual problems. This NDC, I think, will reflect a lot more on the problems, but not perfectly. And the following NDC will hopefully be better, as well as the parallel LEDs, low emissions development strategy. So the actual plan will be better each 5-year period. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but that's the opportunity. Do you want to follow on?
No, my other thing was that because most of the people who are here, we are from the grassroots.
Yeah.
It is also important. I was appreciating the last speaker who was talking about indigenous ways of adapting to climate change. So maybe also from the ground, we can work on those so that we can also make an effort in the meantime to help ourselves with all those indigenous methods of counteracting environmental change.
No, I completely agree. That's fascinating, yeah. Well, we've got one hand there and then we'll come back to you.
Sanibonani, ngigama nguLindi wakanzwana. Elami igalelo nje indaba yemali, ama-finances. Kuchanje, I think it's 2 weeks back, as a group, G4CA, Grassroots for Climate Action, besine uhambo besultathile in terms of community engagements on issues afana lawe NDCs and just transition. And we happened ukuthi sibe eTinarha in Nelson Mandela Bay. There we engaged the community yakwaNobuhle and some surrounding townships around, and also nabo fishermen. Oku-engaging kwethu nama-fishermen mostly njengoba sikhuluma nge-just transition NDC as grassroots for climate action, and then bekunama-concern in terms of ama-livelihoods abo njengama-fishermen in that context. And then we had umama ohlala phaya kwaNobuhle beke kuthetha ama-floods siyazi la eSouth Africa sine KZN, we have a PE la kuthola khona ukuthi kunama-floods. And after her sharing istory sakhe umama lapho athethe khona ngokuthi umntanakhe bekesene-Nelson Mandela University, and it happened ukuthi baphume esikolweni ayofuna ukutya eyitolo. Unfortunately, ngelanga lelo imvula azange ine njengamalanga wonke. And then what happened on that day, it was on the 2nd June 2024, as they went out ukuyofuna ukutya etolo, and then they flooded. They flooded and they were in the car, and the two of them with the driver, and they recovered one body, and the other body they never recovered. So njengoba sine engagement in that, and we asked her, okay, and then what happened to this other girl? And uthi, until today, they never recovered her body. And the reason why, akuzange kube ne-search team ukufunana nomzimba, or maybe after floods there's ama-efforts akunokuthi ayenzwe laphaya. And then he said it took only 2 days. And that was it. Until today, they've never recovered that body. So, ekushereni kwakhe, it came back ukuthi kuma-municipalities, i-finance, i-challenge. So, kuma NDCs, as we plan on just transition, we need we invest more to local governments, to the most governmental structures that are close to people, so that bakhona ukuthi bayenze nama-interventions afana nalawa. We are black, people, we are Africans, and ukulahlekelwa ungangcwabi ithambo lakho is very, very, very painful, and you never get a closure. So, ku NDCs, as our communities, as South Africans, if finance mayilobuwe, be it international or nationally, and mare mayibuya le finance lena, mayilocate to the most vulnerable places where people they will be able to buy access to the finance in terms of kubakhona uku-adapta noma ba-mitigate ama-impacts with climate change. Ngiyabonga.
All right, I will actually translate the conversation. So, Konjubani Kamusisi? Umamlindi, okay, thank you. Umamlindi, so she actually mentioned that she is from Grassroots for Climate Action, and they attended community engagements around the NDCs and the Just Transition in Newton Hague. And there were concerns that were raised, especially around the livelihoods. There were fishermen in the area. And so there were several concerns around adaptation and resilience that were raised. There was in the room a lady who spoke about the floods and direct impacts of the floods, and we know that areas in the Eastern Cape, as well as KZN, are very vulnerable and susceptible to floods. And so the story that was shared was this lady's child who was a student at NMMU, and they had gone to get lunch from the shops, and then there was a flood. It started flooding, and they were in the car. And so what happened was that they could only recover one body. They could only recover one body, and the other body was not recovered. And so it was a boy and a girl, or a male and a female. And so the girl's body was not recovered because there was a search team that went and only searched for 2 days. But the search was also not thorough. And so there's a strong recommendation around that local government finances are very stretched, especially as it relates to disaster relief. And so the recommendation is for increased financing or funding for local government, disaster response and management. And that also, within the NDCs, especially the means of implementation section, the finances should be allocated to those that are most vulnerable in order to prepare for disasters, as well as some mitigation interventions.
Yeah, thank you. Very important. I think this funding for municipalities in general, that's a very important point, but for disaster recovery in particular is a good example here. And what a tragic story. Thank you for sharing that with us. We had the question online, and then we'll come, so if you don't mind, we're going online first, ma'am, and then we'll come back to you, and then we'll come to you, sir, and then Richard.
I think I'm following on one of the speakers who asked a question related to, are we actually not upping the stake, or I don't know how to put it, but are we not going back to the previous reports on the NDC? Because everything is based on modeling, and the modeling relates mainly to the global south and the type of industrial actions in those countries in the south. But I don't see clearly where the policy tracking have been captured. Policies, I mean, what does the country say about, for example, how to when you manufacturing your car, this is the type of technology that you must put in so that there is no too much emission. When you're doing your agriculture, this is the type of transition you must move from doing the normal intensive agriculture to more nature-based solution to agriculture. I don't see the policy tracking. For example, in terms of issues of transport, most of our taxis that are crisscrossing through the country are manufactured according to the same standards as before. But the policy, I think for me, I'll be very happy to say what we report global must match with policy to say we shifted from this policy in terms of doing this to this policy. So it shows that we are determined to say industry by industry, we are reducing our emission. And number two, I don't think it's fair to bundle us with the global south countries. We got to say maybe, okay, do a serious cross-border for the African continent to say, yeah, how are we doing? We are said to be one of the greatest polluters in the country, but I don't see that thing in your documentation. And philosophically speaking, when you do a policy or when you want to change, your heart must be in the issue of saying, I want to change, I want to adapt. Are we there? Or are we just maybe camouflaging our ambitions to say we want to change by giving a lot of statistical data which doesn't say anything to the ordinary people? I believe if a policy has to be understood by the global people, let the citizens say, yeah, we back up that policy. Whether I'm at the lowest level of mankind to the top, but I have to understand that, yeah, indeed, my country is committed to this thing. My issue is, are we committed or are we stagnating or are we going back? In terms of the numbers, we could really argue from a political point of view that we actually doing our best, but is that the true reflection? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Such an important point. We need to mean what we say, and the misalignment of policy suggests that we don't. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, we'll go online to Bridget, and we'll come to you.
We have 3 hands raised online, and we will take Motlatsi Makasane first. And then after him or her, sorry, it will be Mvuzo Ntombela, and then Commissioner Brandon Abdeno.
Thank you.
And then after that, we've got 3 questions in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you.
So good day, everyone. Motlatsi Makasane. I'm based in the Free State. I'm also a steering committee member of the Climate Justice Coalition. Mine would be more of a recommendation that we try and translate these NDCs or NDC commitments into local actions that empower municipalities and communities as well as grassroots organizations. And then under governance and institutional alignment, we're trying to, or what I'm trying to propose or suggest or recommend is that all national climate policies be aligned with provincial and municipal development plans. Also, that be an establishment of a local action committee to integrate the NDCs targets into governance, also to strengthen collaboration between governance and civil society, as well as academia. We would also like maybe around policy integration that be embedded climate action into integrated development plans as well as a special development frameworks. Under financing mechanisms there, we would recommend that be established a local climate action fund for municipal-led projects, so that the issues can be dealt with in that around community-led action. Would like maybe that be a facilitated dialogue like the one that we are having right now. We also that there be empowerment of traditional leaders, women and informal workers, to shape adaptation strategies. We also like there be more capacity building to train officials, entrepreneurs, and community members around on climate governance, green jobs, and carbon low technologies. If maybe there can be an establishment of a climate resilience hub to support community education and early warning systems. Under social equity and the just transition, we would like it that we prioritize livelihood protection for workers affected by coal phase out. We also like a support for skills development program for green economy opportunities, and then that be implemented a social safety net to protect vulnerable populations from the climate shocks that we are currently facing there in areas like KZN. And then on the sectoral localization strategies, especially around energy transition, we would like that be accelerated multi-scale renewable energy development, and then that we promote community-owned energy projects and off-grid solution. We would like also support that local manufacturings be supported with renewable energy technologies. And then the same goes for climate smart agriculture and food systems. The same goes for water and circular, for waste and circular economy. And then around water security and resilience, that there be developed nature-based solutions, around most of people were talking about wetlands. And then we also like that municipality be strengthened, especially with around climate action plan, because the question was that how these NDCs are developed without localization or local inputs. And then the same goes with transport. And then we'll also like that there be monitoring and monitoring, reporting, and knowledge sharing around the issues of NDCs, especially peer-to-peer learning between municipalities and us grassroots organizations. And then lastly, no, I think that's about it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent input. And it actually reminded me, these formats limit what we can say, So we have created an email address called mitigation@climatecommission.org.za. And if you want to submit something longer, you're most welcome. And you can submit it to that email address. It's just come up on screen. Also, if you think of something, the weather's bad today, so you're probably going to be stuck in traffic, and you'll think about something in traffic that you thought I should have said that. Please email it to us. That's what the email address is for, so thank you. Next online person, please.
Mvuso, you can come in. Okay, the next person is Commissioner Brandon.
Thanks, Bridget. I think Desmond might be registered as Mvuso, so I think the hand that's up is from Des, in fact. But let me go, and then that can maybe get sorted out. Thanks. I just wanted to come back to the point made by Janet. So we looked quite carefully at the sectoral emissions targets, particularly for the electricity subsector. And Steve, as you yourself said, the IRP should align with the SETs, which should align with the NDCs. But from what we understood from the SET process, it was very much bottom up. So in other words, the department put forward its policies and measures, and that's what resulted in the SET for that subsector, instead of being the top down. So we could technically get an IRP that is not aligned, and yet it will inform what the targets are going up the chain, and that is problematic, particularly in the case of this next round of the IRP, which has not been a very transparent and complete process. And yeah, the word out there is we might see that being released without having proper public consultation, which would be a problem. A little bit related to that is we have at the very high level the NDCs, which inform our emissions reduction trajectory. And then on the ground, we have state decision makers granting authorization for projects. And there seems to be a very big gap in the middle. So as I said earlier, there are 14 gigawatts of gas to power projects that are in some stage of authorization process. We have the Musina Mikado Special Economic Zone, which could take up to 16% of our carbon budget. So where is the exercise taking place that looks at what carbon space is being allocated to different projects and making sure that that doesn't exceed what our ultimate targets are? And I think all of these things speak to governance. And I know the NDC is not necessarily focused on going into depth on governance, but perhaps it does need to allude to strengthening governance so that these kinds of gaps are addressed. Thanks.
Excellent. Is there other online person aligned?
Yes, there's Michael Boulay, and then we just got another hand now from Musa Baloy, and we have questions in the Q&A. So I think maybe Michael can come through.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Bull. I'm from ICLEI Africa, and at ICLEI Africa, we support local governments on climate, energy, and sustainability. And my comment relates to this, I think, what's the discussion today and the link between on the ground realities and insights and local governments being a bridge to the NDC. And I unfortunately wasn't able to attend the local government session on Friday. But I'm wondering, I think we've been having the conversation for some time in terms of local governments, civil society groups saying that on the ground isn't reflected enough in the NDC, and those that design the NDC saying, but it's all incorporated in there by virtue of how we design and build in the NDC. and you'll hear often cities saying, you know, we can really increase the ambition of an NDC if you consider our inputs. And we don't really know which one of those are true. We don't know how they meet or don't meet. And I think that really comes down to conceptualizing these NDCs differently. And so I'm just wondering, has there been any discussion on if we are to create a more inclusive NDC, methodologically, how are we going about that differently, including, for example, the Metro's contributions or something of such as an example? So, yeah, just interested in comments on that, and I'm sure that will relate to the Friday session. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I guess the short answer is not a huge amount of innovation in how we're driving the NDC process, other than the sort of inclusive mechanisms that already exist within government. And so the consultations that we're running and the consultations that the FFE are running, we specifically, as you mentioned, have an engagement with local government where we're trying to understand their concerns, and we partner with SALGA on many of these engagements to sort of help drive their access. But I think in terms of how we frame and develop the NDC differently, that is probably an innovation for next time, and something that certainly sounds incredibly interesting and something that we should engage on. But the short answer is, you know, I'm not aware of there being any massive innovation in that regard. Okay, so then we're going to jump to the room again, and there was a question here at the front, and then Richard, and then we'll go back online, and then we'll come here, and then I want us a little bit of, okay, so wait, let me pause for a second, because there's so much interaction in the room, which is what we prefer. But some people don't necessarily feel confident enough to talk in the audience, or they might become overwhelmed by all of the questions. And so what we have in the room, and we will also give this to you online, is a kind of post-it note space. And we're basically asking kind of three broad questions. What worries you? It can be anything. What worries you for adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation? And if you have a thought, just write it down. There's post-it notes on everybody's tables. And if you're online, we'll drop the link into the chat. And you can also just use that as a kind of parking board for ideas. And it has exactly the same structure. So the online structure is the same as the in-the-room structure. First question is, what's worrying you? Just jot down what's worrying you, and put it on the notice board, especially if you haven't had the chance to give your say today. Then there's a question, what are the principles we should be thinking about? And again, across adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation. So that one's at the back of the room. Again, just jot down your thoughts and stick the post-it notes on the board. And then the last one is, what kind of actions or targets should we be including? And that's always the hardest one, because you've got to kind of distill all this abstract thinking into one post-it note. But please do also think about that, targets and actions that we should be taking, and you can stick that on the board there as well. And as I say, people online, you have the same board, so please do put post-it notes on there. You should just have to follow the link, and it will automatically log you in, and you can drag and drop post-it notes onto whichever section you're interested in. And as with usual online, you can pinch and move around the board, make it bigger, make it smaller. Okay, so please do that. Please feel free to get up and do it while we're chatting, but otherwise just jot things down as you go along. We'll come back into the room with you, sir.
Kumalo again from G4CA. The NDC, the NDC as I view it as an instrument for mitigating against climate change and extreme weather. But my concern is that there seems to be more emphasis on compliance to the United Nations more than domesticating the process, making it local, and making the local people understand what exactly is NDC, and how can it advance their adaptation strategies. And the other thing that I feel it should be part of our our NDC is how do we align to the 17 SDGs? It should speak to those but at a local level. So how do we domesticate this whole process?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think that the inclusiveness of the process is important feedback, and the focus on local content and context is very important. Thank you. Richard, were you next? And then at the middle table.
Thanks, Richard Worthington, Project 90 by 2030. Partly a question, and then it'll go on to a possible principle that you've talked about for those inputs. You showed us the result of a lot of modeling. I believe it was mostly around the electricity system, but it was economy-wide modeling about some of the indicators that are associated with different national carbon budgets. And so on the national carbon budget, I think it does help to have a bit of a ballpark sense of where we are, and also of what has been studied. So you showed analysis which included a national carbon budget of 8 gigatons. You also noted that South Africa's population is maybe 0.6%, 0.6% of the global population, around there, and our economy maybe 0.7, maybe a bit more than that. But both our population and the size of our economy well below 1% of the global average. You also showed some of the analysis of global carbon budgets consistent with half a chance of staying within 1.7 degrees, which is, you know, not the kind of ambition that Africa needs, but it's very minimum. So, and so we're talking about a global carbon budget of no more than 600 gigatons here on out, right? So this isn't just 2021 to 2050, but we're assuming we're carbon neutral beyond 2050. So that's it. So if the global carbon budget needs to be within 600 gigatons to have a reasonable chance of avoiding catastrophic impacts in Southern Africa, and we have well below 1% of the global GDP and population, 1% of the global carbon budget, and indeed of the carrying capacity of the planet on other vectors as well, would seem to be already assuming that we're entitled to a bit more than the rest of the global average because of our history. So that would mean nationally 6 gigatons. Have there been any studies of how both the opportunities and the challenges involved with something more stringent than the 8 gigatons that has been modeled to date? Something like, for example, 6 gigatons, which a lot of people would say is far more aligned than 8 with the appropriate level of global ambition. And then just in terms of principles, maybe, you know, reiterating that even though South Africa has exceptional national circumstances, including massive unemployment, inequality, and poverty, that more than 1% of global carbon budget, or indeed of the carrying capacity of the planet, would be excessive for South Africa, and therefore that any business lobbyists coming and wanting to propose things that are clearly inconsistent with that are not sincerely engaging with what our nationally determined contribution ought to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so that points to the very complexity of the discussion, right? And you're comparing multiple different things. So Richard mentioned a couple of things there. So half a chance. So those numbers I put up earlier give us a 50% chance of staying below the temperature goal. So if we stay below 275 gigatons, we're still flipping a coin about whether we will stay below or exceed 1.5 degrees. 600 gigatons is closer to a 1.72 degree target. So that gives us a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees, still flipping a coin there. So the inherent conservatism and how that should impact how we think about the degree of our ambition is important. The point that he makes about fair shares is critical. You know, when we look at the literature, at various studies around the world that try different ways of allocating or weighting things like inequality, poverty, and unemployment, we often get allocated carbon budgets smaller than 6 gigatons, sometimes negative, sometimes 4 gigatons, right? And so the debate is between fair share, what would be fair, and what is our best effort. Now, it's impossible to imagine us getting negative carbon budgets, right? 4 gigatons is very hard to imagine. We've modeled up to 7 gigatons. It's feasible, but huge economic and socioeconomic change, right? And so that's the tension, is how do you weigh this, like what's our fair share that sometimes seems unachievable, and what is our best effort? And different people have different views about best effort depending on the timelines they consider. So some of the stakeholders we talk to will say, well, the short-term action that you need to take to get to these long-term goals is disastrous. And we can't afford those short-term impacts in the context of high unemployment and high inequality and high poverty as it is. And thrown in amongst all of this discussion is differing understandings about the impacts of climate change and the technologies that are available and the costs. So it's very complicated. But Richard's point is the crux of this, is how do we go about deciding what is fair and what is our best effort? And our approach to this is, well, let's look at what the economic data says. And as I said, it looks like an 8 gigaton budget would actually be economically neutral and therefore is our minimum effort. Right, and then you can go below that and talk about support and costs and so on. But a lot of people will say, oh no, 10 gigatons is our best possible scenario. But that's the debate we're having. But I think the points that Richard makes around conservatism and risk, we really undervalue and underweight the risk in this conversation. Okay, so then there was a point here, and then we'll go to the table at the back. And then we'll go back online. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Tami Matsego, once again. Thanks for the opportunity. A lot has been said, and which I agree with, that it seems, because I went to the website of DFFE, there's a lot of work that has been done. There's a lot of studies, reports, policies, and so on. Beautiful, beautiful. But they are only known by DFFE, and they end up there. They don't trickle down, not even to provincial level, let alone local government. So, and I've seen a beautiful governance structures at national level where there's an interministerial committee for climate change. My suggestion is, can't we replicate those structures at local government level? Because climate change action is about leadership. You need to set the tone from the top. If you don't have a voice from the leaders who are committed, then whatever we are talking about will just be a talk show. I mean, I've been listening to the SOPAS, State of the Province address. I haven't heard any of the premiers talking about climate change at provincial level, even though the president has said something about climate change at the national level. So if we can have those governance arrangements and also make sure that there's a will from our leadership. Number two, over and above the governance structures, there's also suggestion about climate funding. Our actions need to be funded. And we acknowledge as civil society that government, especially local government, it's not that maybe not all of them are unwilling. It's because of their limited resources. They have to grapple with unemployment, inequality, and poverty issues. So climate change issues are the last in the list of priorities. And there's a window of opportunity here because the president said they are committed to revising the funding model for local government. So can't we use, or that is my suggestion, let us use this opportunity that if they are changing the equitable share allocation for local government, make sure that there is climate budget allocated within that equitable share. Because when the local government report on their key performance areas every year, year in and year out, they know that there is a grant for water that they receive from national government. There is a grant for energy. There is a grant for infrastructure. Let there be that grant for climate change that is integrated into the equitable share allocation. And over and above that grant, let also the government, national government replicate some of the good steps that are done in other departments. Department of Health funds NGOs that are working on health issues. Social development also have NGOs that they are funding. Agriculture, they are also funding small scale farming and so on. But in DFFE, we don't have such similar arrangements. That is the only way where you can make sure that there is local action. If you support them, you cannot support them only through developing a lot of beautiful reports, but demonstrate your commitment by developing this arrangement. So those are my suggestions. But the other one, May here talked about, are we really progressing or are we regressing? What is the policies that are new that we are doing to ensure that we are progressing? Something that I've observed, and I hear nobody saying anything from climate change activists or authorities. We are made to understand now that if you go and buy a solar panel, you need to register it with Eskom. Over and above that, when you register it with Eskom, there is a tariff now that you have to pay Eskom for your solar panel. So to me, it is discouraging us from having these alternate renewable energy product that we need to come up with to go out and let go of the Eskom grid. And when you remain with Eskom, Eskom is saying, whether you are going to have your solar panel or not, I am introducing now a new basic charge. There's a minimum charge, whether you've used electricity or not, I am going to charge you. And over and above then I'll add on the user charge. What are authorities saying about this? Because it is discouraging. To me, it is a regress. What is the commission saying about it? Shouldn't we frown at these new steps or these measures that Eskom is now bringing about, because now they are discouraging our zeal or our commitment to make sure that we go off the coal-led energy generation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, these are such complicated issues, and just on the electricity pricing and access thing, we don't really have time to talk about it here, but it is literally my favorite topic. So if you want to ambush me over lunch, I'll be more than happy to talk about it. But the PCC are actually running quite a big project on that, looking at, the challenges. It costs money to deliver electricity. And we have to recover that money somehow. And either you recover it through the tariff or you recover it through taxes. It's the only way. And so something has to go up. But obviously, you can't make electricity unaffordable to people. And so getting that balance is very complicated. And it's one of the topics we think there's not enough focus on in South Africa. But suffice to say that the PCC have a big program looking at that, and we can give you more details in the break. But some very good points there around national governance, provincial level governance, adequately resourcing what we want to do, aligning our incentives with what we want to do, to your solar panel example. So yeah, these are all well-made points. There was a table at the back, and then we'll come to the table at the front, and then we'll go online.
Cool, thanks, Chair. So the first question I have is around the Climate Change Act, and I know that you did cover it in the beginning of your presentation, but just if we can get some kind of practical steps with the Act. Is it going to make the NDC legally binding? And what can we be doing as civil society to operationalize the Act? Of course, we know it's been signed, but what do we actually need to be doing on the ground to make sure that not only communities, but these climate deals that we go into, how can we make sure that the Climate Change Act is integrated and really does sit as this like overarching policy. Then my second question is around process. So will the PCC be publishing their recommendations on the NDC prior to submitting it to the DFFE, and will that be open for public comment? And then the same question for the actual NDC submission, will that also be open? And maybe that's not a question to the PCC, but will that be open for public comment, and what's the timeline around that? And then my last input is kind of around the debt question. And obviously we all know the current political moment we're in and how that affects finance. But just to get your thinking around how do we actually address the debt question? So we can, it's very well to say, it's not the political moment to get debt cancellation or to get, or even just to speak about debt and grant financing for Africa, but we're also at a very pivotal moment in the climate change, in the climate justice movement, where we actually do need to be addressing things like adaptation, which is not necessarily profit-producing sectors, and so we do need grant financing for that. And how are we, as a leading polluter on the continent, but also this voice in international, the economic platforms, specifically G20, for example, how are we actually going to champion the question around grant versus loans, regardless of whether the US is still part of the Paris Agreement or not?
Well, if you can all come back tomorrow, it'll be about when I'm finished my answer to those questions. I mean, those are really great questions and speak to the broader environment. I mean, on the Climate Change Act, it doesn't specifically make the NDC sort of legally compliant, but the sets which link to the NDC is where the legal compliance comes in, and government has broader stakeholder engagement processes on that and other elements of the Climate Act. And so we really highly recommend you engage on those processes. That's the kind of to your point, what can we do as civil society? That's the space to engage, come into those consultations. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm cautious, but maybe Commissioner Abdenor might want to come in on that. On the sort of the process, I can talk to the PCC process and kind of reflect on what I think the DFFE process might be based on what they did last time. But the PCC process, yes, we will definitely publish our recommendations prior to going to the government, to the president. Typically, the process we run is these kinds of consultations. Everything's broadcast. We're very kind of public about what's said to us. We'll hopefully record what you say to us accurately and publish that in a separate report. So there's access to all of this. And then we will have this colloquium where we bring everybody together and try to thresh out some of the differences. And then we will draft a recommendation that will go to the commissioners for their approval and then back out into public for you to comment on prior for it to being a final submission. So that's kind of our plan. Timelines are really tight on it, as you might imagine. And then that will provide input into the DFFE process, who will do, I imagine, a similar thing. It's kind of what happened last time, is they will draft their position and then put it out for consultation publicly, including having public events around the country, and then they will sort of update and finalize before submission to Cabinet. But that's conjecture on my side. I don't exactly know how the DFFE process will run. In terms of timing, we are trying to get our process completed by around June for input into the DFFE process, and they will obviously be trying to get their process wrapped up by sort of September, October, prior to November COP, when we have to make the submission. So that's the process side. I mean, the debt question, we don't have a good answer to that at all, other than to say there is a need for international financial sector reform that deals with these broader questions about how do we allocate grant versus debt, what do we do about historical responsibility, loss and damage, all of these kinds of things that is happening at a kind of macroeconomic level, being led by people like President Ruto of Kenya and the sort of Barbados group, and that will take time. Like, a decade to resolve. And so on one hand, we strongly think we need to advocate for the kind of financial sector reforms that are needed. And on the other hand, we exist in a financial system that works today, and we have to make some decisions today, and therefore must make the best possible decisions within the framework that we already have. And that, as I said earlier, is more about spending than it is about borrowing. We have to make sure that we are spending our money in a way that generates returns and therefore makes payment of debt a less problematic challenge. It's easier for us to say being a relatively wealthy middle-income country, but for poorer countries, it's a whole different context. But there is that kind of rub, like how do we manage where we live now and the world that we'd like to be in? Yeah, so that's high-level reflections, but clearly really touching the surface of the complexity. Question at the front.
She'll go first and then
Okay, fine, perfect, thank you.
Greetings. So I think we can all agree that majority of the issues in the room are relating to climate financing. And I think when we speak about climate financing, we're looking at the fact that we receive quite a lot of funds from the global north as the global south to essentially support the just transition, right? And so my question then is, I mean, this usually comes through events like your COP28, we received quite a lot of money, billions of rands. And I guess I'd like to ask, how do we ensure that the money that we receive from the global north, we actually utilize or spend in a responsible manner? Because, I mean, it's great to keep taking all this money, but how are we essentially utilizing it? And also, how are we keeping the government accountable in terms of saying, this is how much money is being, and this is how much money that has been spent on this particular field, and how are we going to ensure that as civil society? Apart from that, I think another thing that the state needs to start looking into is maybe ensuring that, there are different, essentially ensuring that we have an idea of what's actually going on with regards to that, because there's also often a discrepancy when it comes to the funds that we're told we're going to receive in South Africa from after COP and the funds that were actually received. So how do we keep the government accountable for that? Thank you.
Great. Do you want to follow on that and I can respond to both?
I think you can answer first and then.
Okay. It's a great input, right? Accountability and reporting on progress of how this money is spent is an important governance function. Some of it is done. So there are, where the money comes from, what it's being spent on is all reported and disclosed by the project management unit within the presidency. So the JET PMU, so the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit, and down to the level of what the grant money has been spent on. So there is a sort of level of accountability there, and obviously it requires you as civil society to monitor that and object when you disagree and so on. PCC did release recommendations on the JET IP and the transparency of the JET IP, which you can find on our website. And I guess the gist of it was transparency is very important, and not only just in reporting on how the money is spent and where it's coming from and the form of it and so on, but also in establishing its priorities. There needs to be a lot more inclusiveness in that process. So, but the gist of your point, which I think is very important, is there needs to be a lot of accountability and reporting on where this money is coming from and what it's used for.
I'm William Zungu. I'm with Stu today from the World Bank Group Youth to Youth. Speak in the mic, sorry. All right, let me just live it up.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask, could we possibly enhance the emissions target, given our commitments to the Paris Agreement and our role in global climate leadership? I think we should adopt a more ambitious target. So that's looking at our current target is about 350 to 420. If we were to reduce that upper limit to about 400. So now looking at those current targets, our current targets, the midpoint is about 385 amount CO2 emissions. So to a proposed midpoint of about 360, we would reduce global temp by approximately 0.011 degrees Celsius, which may seem small, but if all countries were to reduce their emissions at the same proportional rates, which is about 6.5%, we're looking at a global emissions decrease of about 2.6 GTCO2 per year, leading to a total reduction of about 1.17 degrees Celsius in global temp. So that's significantly contributing to keeping our global climate change to below that 1.5 degrees. So I'm not trying to give unreasonable goals, but I'm saying that we mustn't be complacent. We shouldn't be comfortable with just the bare minimum when it comes to climate change. I'm saying we should be more ambitious, pushing ourselves in our targets for climate reductions, and in sort of if you shoot for the stars, you will end up in the moon type of way. So if we shoot for that 400, maybe we might end up in that 420 range. Thank you.
Yeah, the science would agree with you. Yeah, and so with the economic modeling, aiming for those kinds of levels, the economic modeling says is beneficial for our economy and not deleterious, which is what a lot of people think. So yeah, thank you. And the idea of ambition and where this ambition sits is really the core part of what we have to get right in this NDC. Okay, thank you. There were a couple of points online.
Steve, should we take the hands first or go?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay. There's a hand from Musa Baloyi and then Yvette Abrahams. Musa, you can go first and then Yvette, you can come in after.
Okay, good day, viewers online, and good day, those who are in person. I was very concerned based on there's a commissioner two commissioners that indicated about the venue in Venda. One of the commissioners indicated that the air there is fresh, is different from other places, and that is true and is quite interesting. But my concern is about Musina Makaro Special Economic Zone. That project is it's a huge project that comes with development and mining and other parts there. So my concern is about how the nature is there, and the indigenous trees that are there that are only found, a certain species of trees are only found there or that particular place. So that's my concern, because I remember last there was a march or a strike with climate change activists regarding to intervene about that project to be implemented. So I also need it to be in the NDC that such project like that of Musina Makaro and the special economic zones like the one of the Fitahomo Tubat, how are they going to be implemented, and how that project can relate to climate change activities? That was my concern that I want to raise.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I guess just to make the point that not all of this can be dealt with in the NDC, but I think the point that has come up a couple of times now, particularly around that project, is how are we deciding whether that project fits into our carbon plans and our broader sort of natural system and protection of natural systems. And in that case, what are the environmental impact assessments saying, and in particular, how they relate to climate change. So yeah, thank you for raising that concern. One more hand online, and I think we'll start to wrap up.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Yvette Abrams. I'm a small farmer and small business owner. And I just wanted to point out that the one thing that I would like to see your research deal with is the fact that we already lowered carbon emissions. If people recall, during 2020 and 2021, globally, not just South Africa, but let me talk specifically about South Africa, we didn't just slow the rate of growth, we actually reduced carbon emissions globally by about 5%. Now, the reason why I raise this is to point out that we can do it. This is not pie in the sky. This is not something strange and different. This is something that we have already done. And we should not need a global pandemic. I mean, 2020-21 was painful, but we proved that it is perfectly doable because we did it. And before the next global pandemic, it's well known that viruses increase their rate of reproduction the hotter and the more humid the temperature is. So these are things to bear in mind. There will, if we don't change, there will be another global pandemic. There will be another flood. There will be another earthquake. There will be another fire. So I guess my question to you is, do you include those scenarios? I mean, when we have a policy of this is how we're going to reduce carbon emissions, are we also very clear about what are the consequences of doing nothing, number one? And number two, do you look at actual real world examples where we have reduced carbon? Like, what can 2021 teach us about how to do it? And as I say, I don't think this notion that we're going to be able to do it without pain is in any way scientifically justified. There's going to be pain one way or another, but we can kill ourselves or we can try and make a difference. And on that note, I mean, I've heard so many questions from you people that work with communities out there. It makes me sad because I've been working with climate change since 2009. It makes me sad that there are people that are still unreached. But you know, is the PCC then going to, clearly the job is bigger, but again, I think the person that pointed out that COVID was a perfect example of how civil society could make a difference is again something that needs to be studied. But don't walk away from here thinking that you have to wait on government or PCC. You can go out there into your front yard and plant a tree and you will have made a difference for that day. You can negotiate with your workplace that I'm only commuting to work twice a week and the rest of the week I'm staying at home. You will have done something. You can refuse to buy from high carbon emitters. You can buy from small business people that you know are low carbon emitters. So don't give away that power to government there. Those were my questions to PCC and my recommendations to civil society.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for those words of encouragement. We can do it and we can make a difference. But accurately also observing that it will take some pain. We do have to change the way that we do things, but it can be done. And it can be done in such a way that changes how economic action benefits people, and it can be done in such a way that more people benefit from economic investment than happens now. And just to make the point that we are looking at what has been done both here and around the world to help us reduce emissions, and the counterpoint is very important. We cannot afford to do nothing. We have to act on this. If we do nothing, it will be far worse. So I know that there's still some people who want to make inputs. I really encourage you to write thoughts on Post-it notes, both here in the room and online. And we're going to break for lunch soon, but you're not allowed to come to lunch unless you've put a Post-it note up. It's our rule. So think about what you want to contribute there. And then just as a kind of wrap, a huge thank you from us for your participation, especially for those of you who traveled in our terrible Joburg traffic and terrible weather. We really appreciate your inputs. And I've taken pages and pages of notes and so many important things that we have to think about. And some of the themes that came up, procedural justice and including communities. We talked about simplifying the communication. We talked about mainstreaming. We talked about awareness raising and shifting our focus away from the technical to be more accessible. We talked about better institutionalization of this. We need to better integration across departments. Department of Education came up in particular. Local experience and solutions are key. How do we bring in indigenous knowledge and local experience of climate change? And we had butterflies and frogs as really important examples. Resourcing and how to access those resources, particularly for communities and the poor, was a strong theme. Broader partnerships between business and government and civil society, capacity building has come up. Learning from things like Komati, acknowledging that it's an economy-wide effort and we need to be thinking about social ownership and distribution mechanisms. And there was a strong call for phasing out of fossil fuels, a strong call for unity and engagement across environmental and social groups, using CBOs and NGOs to create awareness and drive collective effort. We must be conscious of other sustainable development goals and other sustainable development processes, so we can't just exclusively focus on climate change. We must consider, I mean, it's one of my favorite themes, we must consider our agency and our role as civil society partners. And this idea of translating the NDC into local actions came up. We can't do that as the PCC on our own. We need your support in thinking that through. Collaboration as a broad theme came across, more funding and support for local governments, allocating finances to the most vulnerable. We must align our policy. That was quite a long conversation about policy alignment across different departments, taking into account our local circumstances. We talked about we need to mean what we say. Involvement of traditional leaders was interesting. That also came up with the faith community groups. Inclusion of women, disabled and youth was a strong theme. Prioritizing the just transition framework came up, and within that, issues of economic diversification, social inclusion, finance, skills development, but a strong emphasis on governance. Many of you talking about governance and policy alignment and replicating national structures into local structures. Spatial planning came up, monitoring, reporting, and knowledge sharing. Establishing mechanisms to align policies, but also vertically spheres of government so that you get the same messaging from government, national, provincial, and local government. And then the idea of adequate funding and adequate resourcing and aligning incentives to what we want were all important ideas. Now, I don't pretend I caught everything, so we will do a much better job of summarizing what was said and sharing that back with you, but what a rich conversation. We really appreciate the time that you've given to us today. So I'm going to wrap there with just a couple of key things. The conversation is not over. Please remember, if you have any further thoughts, you must email us on mitigation@climatecommission.org.za, and we will be monitoring that inbox. But we also invite you to participate in our other stakeholder engagement processes, both for this process and other projects we're running. And the next event for us on this will be the NDC colloquium, where we all come together again. On a very pure admin note, please can you return these tags to us? We want to recycle them, and so you can, if you want to keep the sort of insert bit, you're most welcome, but if you can return the sort of plastic tags to us, you also need this for access to your lunch. So please do return this afterwards. And then the most important task of the day, today is Simpiwe's birthday, and so we want to wish her a very happy birthday, and we've got a slice of cake with some candles, and we want to sing happy birthday to Simpiwe. So if you'll join me in singing for Simpiwe. Happy birthday to you. Birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Simpiwe.
Happy birthday to you. Hip hip.
Happy birthday. All right, so with that, thank you everyone. Happy birthday, Simpiwe. Hope you have a lovely day. And thank you for working on your birthday. And we will see you at lunch. Please do join us for lunch. As I said, out the door, down to your right, and you'll see it there. And we look forward to chatting more to you, especially about energy issues. Thank you. Have a lovely day. Don't forget post-its. If you don't put post-its on, and not just things that worry you, we need actions and targets. Thank you.